Blender's UV editor feels pretty barren the first time that it is open, but hidden in there are actually quite a lot of very useful tools. I want to show you how we can use Blender to unwrap a complex, organic 3D model, such as a head that you could want to use for the main character of a video game. This is a full tutorial on unwrapping within Blender, and we'll cover everything from the very basics of the interface all the way to answering very advanced questions, such as how can you mirror the UVs of an object without having to split the mesh in two, and especially if the position of the vertices of that object are asymmetric. Or how can you control the UVs so that they flow in a direction that is consistent with the curvature of a surface as opposed to fight against it. We'll go really deep into unwrapping as a discipline, and we'll learn how to evaluate the result that automatic unwrapping tools may give us, and how to improve that result, such by rebalancing the UVs in the zones of a model that the observer is more likely to see. These are notions that will be very useful to you, even if you already know the basics of unwrapping with Blender, or even if you use other softwares than Blender to do your unwrap. Finally, we're going to end the discussion with a presentation of the steps involved to take a retopologized and UV'd model and merge it back with an original high poly that may have served as the base. We'll see how we can preserve all the details that we have sculpted on our original high poly and also preserve things like vertex color. I promise that by the end of this class, you will have all the information that you need to be able to unwrap any kind of complex organic model that you may be working on. But that's not all that I'm giving you today.
This is for you.
I'm also providing you with a free base mesh that you can use either to follow along this class or in your own projects. And in true Blender fashion, I am releasing this head under GPL version 3 license. I've worked hard to make this an absolutely awesome base mesh that you can use within your own projects. And it has features such as carefully modeled eye creases that can support a wide range of morphologies, and eyelids with compressed UVs that unstretch when the eyes are closed. Face sets bordering key edge loops such as the nasolabial fold and eye creases. These face sets make it easy to isolate part of the face when sculpting. Anatomically correct edge flow around the region of the crow's feet for better deformation in that zone. Edge flow in the neck that nicely supports the sternocleidomastoid. Extremely clean topology and UVs with minimal wasted texture space. This class and this head are premium content that I normally only release to Outgang members on outgang.studio, but it is my pleasure to release them all for free for you today. You can get this head by going to outgang.studio and filling in the form on the front page, and I'll send you a link where you can download this head. You'll get a zip file that contains this base mesh as a Blender file, this base mesh as a ZBrush file, which also includes the polygroups in there, and this base mesh as an FBX. If the form ever disappears from the front page, check the description of this particular video for an updated link. And if you're already a member of outgang.studio, you simply have to go on your account page, and in the Handouts tab, you will see the head there that you can download. Outgang.studio is a platform I created to share everything that I know about character art, organized into classes and chapters that not only cover the basics of the tools, but more importantly, how to use those tools to create great character art and how to judge the value of your own work. I believe in taking the time that it takes to break a topic down layer by layer, like an onion, where talking about the tools of the trade is only the outer layers, and peeling every layer off until we get to the core of understanding. On the platform, you'll find in-depth classes on how I have sculpted this head from scratch, how I have retopologized it, and in the future we will cover how to create skin pores, fine wrinkles, and other tertiary details for this head. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. in terms of the content that is available on outgang.studio. But whether you become a member or not, go on the platform and grab that base head so that you can use it in your own personal projects or to follow along this class as we unwrap it together. Because this class is pretty long, I want to give you an overview of the order in which we will cover the topics. And you have comprehensive chapters at your disposal if you want to jump ahead to a specific part of this class. There are 3 main sections to this class. During the first section, we'll do an overview of all of the tools, techniques, and add-ons that we will be using to unwrap this head together. We'll talk about seams and how to do a quick unwrap of a 3D model. And depending on the importance of that 3D model, that could actually be all that you need to be able to finish your unwrap. We'll talk about Blender's UV grab, relax, and pinch brushes. We'll talk about Blender's UV straightening tools, and a lot more than that. This first section is targeted at newcomers who have never used Blender's UV editor before, and it lasts roughly 75 minutes. The second section of this class will be a discussion of how to use Blender's tools to improve the automatic unwrap that we will have done for this head. How to rebalance the UV density and flow to bring more texels within the zones of the object that truly matter to us. This second section is meant to help anyone who deals with heads or other organic 3D models and would like to know how to get the best possible unwrap for that. So if you're not interested in learning the basics of Blender's UV interface, but you simply want to know how you can get a better unwrap result, then you can skip right over to the second part of this class. It's going to take us about 90 minutes to complete this second section. And the third and final section of this class is how to do projection, meaning how to take the retopologized and UV'd head that we have completed and merge it back with the original high poly, still at the remesh stage, and how to transfer all the details that we will have sculpted on that original high poly onto the new clean topology. And we'll also talk about how to transfer vertex color over. At the conclusion of this class, we'll be in a great position to start to work on the tertiary details, namely the skin pores and the fine wrinkles of the head in a future class on outgang.studio. If you intend to follow along and unwrap this head with me, go and grab the base mesh now so that we can get started. Let's do this. Just a quick word about this particular file. You may notice that the checkerboard that I currently have applied on the model does not come with the file that you have downloaded. And the reason for that is because we will generate this checker later together when we explore an add-on called Text Tools. Second of all, because our goal is to unwrap this head from scratch, we actually want to get rid of the UV map that is already there so that we can recreate it ourselves later on as well. So to erase the UV map that is currently here, it's very simple. Simply have to select the head, then go within your object data properties, and you can see that I'm already on that tab right here, and then go within UV map, and in there, simply click on the minus here to remove the current UV map from the head. This head looks like Pepto-Bismol because we still have the checker texture that is applied to the head, even though we have gotten rid of the UV map. So I'm just going to go within the material properties here, and I'm going to remove the checker that is right here from the base color. You won't have to do that on your side, though, because there won't be a checker applied within the file when you open it. And finally, you can see that the file in which I'll be working looks a little bit different than yours because I'm using an HDR that does not come with Blender, and I also have the high poly in there. But other than that, the low res is exactly the same. So you'll be able to follow along step by step without any issues. So there's 2 ways in Blender that we can access the UV editor. The first one is simply to switch our tab here on the top from whichever tab on which we are to the UV editing tab. And if we do that, we'll see that we will be in a situation here where we will have on the left our UV editor, and on the right we will have our normal 3D viewport that is there. Now this particular head does not currently have any UVs, that's why we're not seeing anything within the UV editor, and it is using a texture that was previously used on the eyes as the background. So that's why we have this particular texture that is here. But we could work in this to create our UVs. It's just not my favorite way to work or to access the UV editor. There's really nothing wrong with accessing the UV editor in this particular way. And if this is the way that you prefer to work, then that is wonderful. And I encourage you to continue to do so. But personally speaking, I would rather open the UV editor as a separate window and not disturb the main window of Blender that I had before, because in this particular window, the one that we have right here, and we have our head, we have our low res, we have our high res here, I've kind of already configured this particular 3D window to essentially be the way that I want it to be in terms of perspective, in terms of lighting, in terms of visibility of the objects in there. So truth be told, I just don't really want to disturb that. So I would rather open the UV editor as a completely separate window, and in fact, even keep that second window on a separate monitor, as opposed to have both windows, the UV editor and the 3D viewport, condensed into one monitor. Of course, if you have a computer where you only have one screen, then you'll need to have the UV editor and the 3D viewport on the same screen, of course. So in essence, choose whichever approach that you want. There's really no right or wrong way here, but there are different approaches that some of us will have different preferences for. So what I like to do then, because I really want to keep this particular 3D viewport the way that I have configured it, is to open the UV editor, is to simply go to View here, and then afterward go to Area, and duplicate Area into a new window. This gives us a new window of Blender, as you can see. And on the top left here, we can actually choose the editor type using this little drop down that is right here. And what we want to do is to simply select in there the UV editor right here. And this is functionally the same as if we had switched over to the UV editor tab, because we have our UV editor window that is here, and then we have our 3D viewport that is here. Because this is a separate window, I can take it and I can slide it over to a secondary monitor so that I can edit my UVs there and come back on the main screen to see the result of that. I suppose alternatively, as a perhaps third approach, as a third thing that you could do, would be to actually split your main window here. So just by placing my cursor in the corner until it changes to a little cross like this, I could here do a simple click and drag, which would allow me to split our main viewport into two separate views. And in there, yet again, I could actually go within the top left corner here and then switch over to the UV editor. This really gives us the exact same result as if we had switched over to the UV editing tab. But once again, it keeps all of the settings, all of the configurations that we had previously set within our 3D viewport. So personally speaking, I would actually even rather work like this if I had only one monitor. This probably would be my preferred approach than even to keep a separate window that is open or to switch over to the UV editor tab. Choose your poison, do it in whichever way that you want. Let me close this particular area here. And so because I have two screens attached to this computer for this particular class, I will simply swap back and forth between the main screen and the secondary screen where the UVs are. And if necessary, I will do some type of split screen where you can actually see both results at the same time, if it makes sense to do so here. So of course, right now, our UV editor is completely blank. And in fact, we don't even have any tools at our disposal here to do any type of UV editing, because we do not have any object that is selected and in edit mode, of course. So if we want to actually access the UVs for a particular object, first we have to select it, of course. But after that, we have to go within edit mode to be able to edit its UVs here. So now that our head is selected, and we switch over to edit mode, now we can start to work on the UVs. But if we look within our UV editor, we can see that we still do not have anything in there at all. And the reason for that is because there's simply no UVs existing for this particular head. Since we have done our retopology and we have started from scratch, no UVs have ever been generated for this particular head. So right now, there simply is nothing that we can manipulate in here. So the fastest way we can actually get some data within our UV editor that we can start to manipulate is to go back to our main window. And while we are in polygon mode here, or in face select mode, as you can see here, press 3 on your keyboard to access that. And in fact, let me also turn on our shortcuts here so that we can see what those actually look like. I've pressed 3 here to go within face select mode, and I'm going to press A to simply select all of the faces of this particular object. I'm going to press U on the keyboard to access our UV mapping menu, which you could also access by simply going here on the menu here on the top. And within this UV mapping menu, we're going to select the first option here, Unwrap. You can see that we finally have some data in here. Of course, this is not proper data. This is not a proper way to unwrap a head, but it gives us UV data that we can see within our UV editor, which in turn exposes extra menus and extra options within our UV editor. So now we can finally manipulate UVs and explore the UV editor together. One thing that is important for us to talk about right now is this little sync button that is right here. You can see if I turn this UV sync selection button on or off, you can see that it actually changes some of the buttons that are right here. So it's really good to think about this UV sync selection button as a way to toggle between 2 different workflows to UVing within Blender that are not always compatible with each other in terms of tools. When UV sync selection is turned on, you will always be able to see within your UV editor all of the existing UVs on a particular object without having to have anything that is selected. With my UV sync selection that is turned on, I can do a selection here within our UV editor. And if I select here a bunch of random polygons and we go back here to our 3D window, you'll see that those polygons have been selected on our low res. Just to make our lives easier here, I'm actually going to switch the rendering mode to the solid shading mode here. And I will actually isolate our head as well by pressing / here on the numpad so that we only see the low res here. It's going to make our life a little bit easier for now. So with UV sync selection that is turned on, if I do a selection within our 3D viewport, that selection will also be reflected within our UV editor. If you're coming from other softwares, Maya, 3ds Max, it'll feel right at home for you to see all of the UVs that is on an object when that object is in UV editing mode. And personally speaking, I actually really like to work within this particular mode for that particular reason. But the problem with the UV sync selection is that it actually is very limited. There's a lot of tools that do not work with UV sync selection that is turned on. So sooner or later, we actually have to get used to working with UV sync selection that is turned off. And so if we go ahead and we turn it off, you'll see that now our UVs have completely disappeared from our UV editor. So our first instinct is to think that our particular object does not have any UVs at all. But that is actually a lie. What happens if you turn UV sync selection off is that within the UV editor here, you will only see the UVs for the part of the object that is selected within the 3D viewport. And right now you can see that I do not have any faces selected. Therefore, I have no UVs that are displayed within the UV editor. This is very awkward if you come from another 3D software. This really won't make a lot of sense to you, but hey, this is how Blender works, and it's not all that hard to get used to it. If I make a selection here within our 3D viewport, you will see that now within our UV editor, we only have the UVs here, and I can actually deselect even. I can do a separate selection, in fact, for what is within our UV editor. But what we are seeing here, the UVs that we are seeing displayed within our UV editor are only the UVs for whatever is selected within our 3D viewport. So the best way that I have found to get used to working in this particular way with UV sync selection that is turned off, and as I've said, for a lot of cases, it is actually preferable to turn it off because a lot of tools, a lot of more advanced tools of Blender do not actually work when UV sync selection is turned on. So if you want to see all of the UVs of your object, when you have UV sync selection that is turned off, simply go to your main viewport. And when you are within edit mode, press A, which will select everything, which in turn makes it so that within the UV editor, all of the UVs of the object will always be displayed, even if you click somewhere here and you deselect any of the faces that were selected. We have what is essentially a different selection for our UVs within our UV editor than the selection that we have within our 3D viewport. So I really just wanted to mention this right away because, as you can see, turning sync selection on or off changes the options that we have here. And if UV sync selection is turned off and you have nothing that is selected within your viewport, you will not see any of the UVs that you have on your particular object, which will be a bit of a head scratcher if you're coming from a different 3D software. Okay, so let's go ahead here and do a first unwrap of this particular head because we need to have some data here that we can manipulate and explore together within the UV editor window. Our unwrapping algorithm gave us this mess because our unwrapping algorithm does not currently know where we want to have seams on our particular object. So of course, if we want to get some proper UVs going on for this particular head, we obviously have to start to put down some seams over this head so that when we are unwrapping the head, we get a much better unwrap than what we currently have. So let's briefly talk about seams, how you can place them, and how they will affect the unwrap that you will get afterward. And for this particular section, let me turn UV sync selection back on. So the seams that we place on the head, there's perhaps a few different approaches that you can use, but it more or less always kind of boils down to what we will do here. It's just like poles. There's really only so many places where you can place poles that make sense on a head, and the UV seams are kind of the same. There's really a few places where you more or less always want to have seams, and those more or less have become standardized. But of course, different projects, different artists will probably want to change these very slightly. The most important seam for a particular head is the T seam that runs from the front of the forehead all the way down to the back of the neck, and which will allow us to simply spread open the whole head when we do an unwrap there. So we want to create a seam that has a bit of a shape like a T. So within our edit mode here, I'm just going to press 2 to switch over to our edge selection mode. And I'm going to select the edge here that is at the bottom of the neck on the symmetry line at the back of the neck. I'm going to hold Control to select shortest path, and I'm just going to grow this particular selection until we get somewhere around the front of the forehead, but not so low on the forehead that we are past where the hairline would be. So we kind of more or less have to imagine where the hairline would be for a particular character, and we want to continue this selection until we are just a little bit behind where the hairline would be. Of course, if you're working on a character that is bald, then your character probably won't have any hairlines, so ultimately you can do this selection more or less anywhere that you want, but I still would advise you not to have a seam running down on the forehead itself because it will simply make texturing a lot more complicated there. So this feels like a pretty good place to stop. I would be behind the hairline. In fact, I could actually deselect one edge here just to make sure that I am behind the hairline. This is a pretty good place here. We are pretty much at the junction where we go from the top plane of the head to the forehead here. So I'm actually quite happy here. But before I create the rest of the T, we can actually commit this to become a seam. So to create a seam with this, very simple. Open your UV mapping menu by pressing U on your keyboard. And then afterward, go to Mark Seam right here. And you can see the color of these edges will switch to red to indicate that there will be a UV seam. And then to complete our T, let's go from one side of the head, hold down Control again, and let's select the edge on the other side that will be symmetrical to that. So I believe it's this one here. Yeah, that makes sense to me. You could count edges if you're not actually sure about that, but I believe it's this one here. And same thing here. Let's press U. And let's mark a seam with this. So that's our first seam that we have created on the head. We could actually already go unwrap this and see the kind of result that we would actually get from this. So why don't we do that here? Let's press 3 to go to face select mode. Let's press A to select everything. Press U, and then let's go to unwrap, or you could press U to quickly unwrap this. And take a look at this within our UV editor. We now already have UVs that are starting to look like a face. Fortunately, they're kind of rotated here at 90 degrees. This may or may not happen for you. For some reason, this is happening for me. But you can already see that we're starting to get something that looks a lot more like a head here than what we had previously. Now, if we simply quickly explore this, you can see that there's a few regions here where the UVs are becoming extremely dense, which is where we have our mouth bag here. Because right now the mouth bag is still connected to the head and it has not been split off within the UVs. So a lot of this particular zone right here where the mouth is actually occupied by the mouth bag. And you can see we can actually zoom in here and the polygons are becoming extremely, extremely small. So obviously this has to change. And we're kind of getting a little bit of the same result here with the eye bags, although it's not nearly as bad. And we also have our ears here that are also becoming extremely dense. Same thing for the nose, but the nose, we won't want to detach it. So we'll just keep it the way that it currently is. So yeah, in just a few seconds, we already have done a first pass on the unwrap of this particular head that already looks kind of okay. But as you can see, there's definitely more work here that needs to be done. So let's split off then the mouth bag, the eye bags, and we can also split off the ears while we're there. You don't technically have to split off the ears. Sometimes some people will rather want to keep the ears attached to the rest of the head within the UVs to not have to deal with a particular seam around the border of the ears. But since we have actually modeled a poly loop that goes all the way around, we're going to be able to split off the ear without having to create too much or any staircasing really around the border of the ear. So I actually feel quite good about splitting the ear off. And we also have a lot of tools at our disposal to hide that particular seam in the texturing afterwards. So I personally feel pretty good about splitting the ear off, but you could choose to keep the ear attached to your head within the UVs. The drawback of that, of course, is that you will start to get less resolution through the ears texturing wise, because we are compressing all of that ear within a smaller space. So the drawback of keeping the ear attached is that you have less texture density afterward to texture your ears. But the advantage of that is that you have one seam less to deal with. So there again, choose your poison. Personally speaking, I've done both throughout my career. I've gone back and forth between these two approaches. In this particular case, I feel like detaching the ears. So that's what we are going to do together there. So to separate off the mouth bag, the eye bags, and the ears, also very simple, okay? We'll simply go and we will select the edge that we want to split off, so where we will mark our seams. And let's start with the mouth bag here. So I'm just going to zoom in here until we are within the mouth bag of the character there. And I'm going to select the first loop of the mouth that is on the inside of the mouth. So not necessarily on the border here of the lips, because this seam here, if I select this particular edge that is here to mark the seam to create the mouth bag, I feel as if the character opens their mouth, there might be a chance that we will actually see the seam. The seam could be a little bit harder to hide. Now, of course, characters don't often open their mouth, and let's say that you are within a video game, the game does not often pause to the point that you could, that a particular player could appreciate that there's a particular seam that is here. So truth be told, this seam would actually be very safe, okay? But personally speaking, just to be very extra safe in this particular case, I'm just going to select one loop deeper there. But if you were to create your seam here, I don't think that that would necessarily be a faux pas, so to speak. I think that would still be probably pretty fine. Anyway, I'm going to select this particular seam here because I feel better about this one. And yet again, let's press U and let's do a mark seam. Or if you want to do it quickly, press U, press M to mark this as a seam. For our eye bags, let's hold Alt here, select the contour of the eye. Here, I will want to select the border of the caruncles. This edge right here, let me hold Alt Shift to grow the selection. Select the top here, do that on both sides. And press U, press M to mark that as a seam. Finally, for the ears, even though we have a poly loop that goes all the way around the ear, since we haven't split this with an extra edge, it means that on both sides of this particular poly loop, we have edge loops that will have poles on them. It's not the end of the world, really. So in my case here, I would actually rather select the edge loop here that is on the inside of the poly loop that we have created that goes all the way around the ear. Let's make sure it's continuous. We have a little section here towards the back that we need to select. And finally, let's do this selection on both sides. Press U, press M, mark this as a seam. So that's all the seams that we need. If you're particularly motivated, I suppose you could actually split off the inside of the nostrils too. It's a matter of personal preference, but the inside of the nostrils really don't have that much volume to begin with, since you can see that they really don't go all that deep there. So just to save myself from having to deal with this particular seam in the future, I'm going to keep the inside of the nostrils merged with the rest of the nose here, but you could actually decide to split this off. It's really not a problem. You'll just have to deal with this seam here and hide the seam at the texturing stage later on. Okay, so that's all the seams that we need. So let's go to face mode yet again. Press A, select everything. Press U to do an unwrap of this. And there you go. Take a look at the result here within our UV editor. You can see what it actually looks like. So we have our main UV island here for the head. We have a much better distribution of polygons around the mouth, around the eyes. And we have those extra UV islands for the eye bags right here. These are the ears, and this is the mouth bag. We'll probably have to split the mouth bag later on, because there too we have polygons here that are becoming extremely, extremely small. But let's leave that for later. This gives us all the data that we need to start to explore together the UV editor. I suppose as one last step before we start talking about other tools, I could actually select everything that I have here. So here I have my UV sync selection that is still turned on. Let me press A within the UV editor to select all of the UVs. Let's press R to go within rotate mode. And then let's hold Control as we do our rotation until we have rotated this by 90 degrees exactly, as we can see on the top left of our UV editor. Let's quickly cover a few other important shortcuts and functions that you need to know at this particular stage. First of all, if you want to select UV islands, you want to press L on your keyboard as your mouse hovers over a particular island somewhere. So if I want to select the island here of the face, let me put my cursor over it, press L, and now I have that particular UV island that is selected. If I put my cursor over another UV island and also press L, I will add to that particular selection. And if I hold Shift while I press L, I will remove from my selection. This works when you are in the 3D viewport as well. We've added a bunch of seams here, so as I hover my cursor over my 3D model, if I press L here, you'll see that I'll also be able to select the corresponding UV island. L is a shortcut for something called Select Linked that you can see at the bottom left of the interface right now. And so we could actually select with L using other parameters, such as the normal, which in this particular case would mean that we would select the whole object, material, so on and so forth. But in our case here, let's keep this on seam so that we are selecting based upon the seams that are on the object. This works whether you have sync mode that is turned on or off. So if I disable sync mode and I select my whole object here within our 3D viewport, this will work just as well. If I press L as I hover over a particular island somewhere, you can see that I will also be selecting it. But when you have UV sync selection that is turned off, you can alternatively also switch over to UV select mode right here to select islands directly. And the shortcut for that is 4. So if I was, let's say, on select faces right here, and I press 4, I can go to select UV island mode. And now I don't have to press L. I can just click on a particular island to select it. 3D softwares often have many ways of doing the same thing. Something that might happen to you that will be very curious the first time that it happens is that if I turn UV sync selection here back on, and I am in face select mode, as you can see, we know where the seams are on our head. And in fact, actually, let me just magnify this particular UV window that we have. So we know where the seams are placed. They're placed essentially all the way around our UV islands, of course. But while I am in face mode right here, if I select a polygon somewhere and hold G to move it, you can see that I'm actually moving a polygon, and that polygon seems to be detached from the other polygons that we have on the head, even though we know that there are no seams here that we have placed ourselves. If we go here within our 3D viewport, you can see here that there are no seams that have been placed around the border of that particular polygon. So it is very curious that that polygon moves independently than the rest of the faces. We would actually expect the vertices that are on the corners of that particular polygon that are connected to other vertices within our 3D viewport, we would expect those to stretch and for this whole UV island to stay as one continuous island, as opposed for this particular polygon to move separate from everything else. I can do here box selection of other polygons, press G again, and you can see that the same thing happens. So what is going on here? This is very, very curious. Well, this is one of those limitations that we've been talking about working with UV sync selection. Unfortunately, when UV sync selection is on, the moment that we select a polygon, it will move independently than all the other polygons, even though technically they should be connected together there. It's simply a very odd behavior of Blender, but it doesn't mean that there's anything that is broken. And to better understand what is going on, it is better for us to turn UV sync selection off so that we can talk about a particular function of Blender. Let me do Control Z here until we have all our polygons that are placed back where they need to be. Let me turn UV sync selection off. In our 3D viewport, let's press A over our head to select everything. And within our unwrap window now, if I select a face and I move it, you'll see that now we're actually getting the behavior that we expect to get as we move a polygon around. That polygon moves and all vertices that are connected to it UV-wise, all those UV vertices, if you will, all move in synchronicity. So even though we are moving a polygon, the UV island stays as one. So it's obviously very curious that when UV sync selection is on, that these polygons move independently. Let me do Control Z here to bring this particular polygon back to its original location. And the answer to the puzzle here is this particular sticky selection mode that is right here. By default, this will probably be on this shared location option that you have here. If I press the little arrow here, that is the drop-down menu. You can see we have three options for this: disabled, shared location, or shared vertex. Shared location will act the way that you probably expect it to work, especially if you're coming from different 3D software. But if I disable this particular sticky selection mode, so if I select disabled here, and we select the polygon yet again, and hold down G, you can see that now we're getting the same behavior that we were getting before, which is that we are moving these polygons independently from their connected UV island, even though we technically don't seem to have any seams that are getting added here. If you read the tooltip for this particular option, you'll see here that if I put my cursor over shared location, so the default option here, the tooltip says select UVs that are in the same location and share a mesh vertex. Whereas for disabled here, it says sticky vertex selection simply disabled. Shared vertex says select UVs that share a mesh vertex, whether or not they are in the same location. So what does that all mean? Well, shared location simply means that when you move a polygon, Blender will also move all of the vertices of all other polygons that are connected to it, as long as there aren't a seam at that particular location. Or you could also say in another way that within the UV editor of Blender, all polygons all have vertices that are in a way unwelded from each other, which some software called vertex face or face vertices. If you come from Maya, you've probably seen that in there, and you've seen that you can indeed select vertices for each polygon individually under certain context, even though those vertices are merged with the vertices of neighboring polygons. Gets a little bit confusing, I know, but hey, this is how it works. So in a way, all these polygons, they're vertices, even though here we have two polygons that are neighbors. You can kind of consider that the vertices and the edges between those two polygons are kind of technically unwelded in a way. And so if sticky selection mode is turned off, Blender will allow you to move the vertices connected to a particular polygon independently than the vertices of the neighboring polygons, even though technically, once again, they are welded together. This is kind of weird and certainly very confusing at first. But so to make sure that you are avoiding any kind of problems with this, make sure that you are working with UV sync selection off if you are manipulating polygons, and make sure that your sticky selection mode is set to shared location. If we switch over here to shared vertex, you'll see that we may get behaviors that is even weirder than that. Let me take this particular polygon, let me move it out of the way here. If I select the vertices that are connected to this particular polygon that is here, you can see that I can independently manipulate them. But if I switch here over to shared vertex, actually, and I select this particular vertex, you'll see that we'll select the vertices of all other neighboring polygons that are connected to this particular polygon. So essentially the vertices that are overlapping in 3D space. And we can move all of those at the same time, even though they are now existing in different positions in space. This is kind of weird. This could be useful in certain cases if you want to straighten an edge somewhere or a series of edges somewhere. I suppose this could be kind of useful. In practice, I don't think we'll probably be using shared vertex in any sort of way. And in fact, most of the time we'll be using shared location. The problem with this little drop-down menu is that it simply does not exist when you have UV sync selection that is turned on. So if I turn UV sync selection back on here, you can see that we simply do not have that option in any sort of way. If I move a polygon, it is moving independently from other neighboring polygons. But if I select a vertex, that vertex will move as if we had shared vertex that was turned on. So the moment that you're done creating your seams and you have done a first unwrap of your head, you definitely will want to turn off UV sync selection so that you can continue to work on this head. Okay, so what happens if you accidentally move one of these polygons around and then you want to move them back at their original location? If I want this particular polygon and I want to move it back so that its vertices are overlapping, what am I supposed to do about that? Well, I suppose there's a few different things that you could do. You could go within vertex mode here. You could turn on snap and snap to vertex, and you could manually snap these vertices back where they belong. That's one way of doing it, but this could be time consuming if you have a lot of vertices. So alternatively, what we could do is to select the edges that have been detached, go to our UV menu that is right here, and simply do a stitch on top of these, or press Alt V to access that particular function. Then we want to press Enter to commit to the operation, and our polygon will go back to its original location. And if I wanted to, I could do that on all of these edges that I want to stitch back together. Press Alt V, and then press Enter to commit. Let's do the same thing with these edges right here. Select them, Alt V, press Enter. Now, of course, the question is, how does Blender know to move these polygons back within their UV islands and not instead move the UV island to where the polygons were? And I highly suspect that the way that Blender deals with that is by simply moving whichever is the smallest island back to the largest island. Although I haven't completely confirmed that, but I strongly believe that that is simply the logic here. Also, just one last thing I'd like to mention at this particular stage. Within our 3D viewport, you can see that I have wireframe that is turned on this particular object. Even if I do not have it selected here, even if I'm in object mode here, I still have the wireframe that is visible in this particular object. The shortcut for wireframe within Blender is Z. So if I go ahead here and press Z, you can see that we actually are toggling between what would be the wireframe mode and the non-wireframe mode. If I toggle back here between those two modes that are right here, which is what the shortcut Z does here, I'm really not that big of a fan, okay, of how this actually looks once we press Z, because, well, I simply like to also see when I am looking at the wireframe, I like to also be able to see what the surface of the model looks like, have a bit of a sense for what the 3D volume looks like. So just something here that I think is actually quite interesting to mention at this particular stage. If you go within your drop-down menu here for the viewport overlays, there's actually a button here to also turn on, as you can see, wireframe. And if I turn this on or off, you can see that we have the wireframe that is displayed on top of the shaded model when wireframe here is turned on. So this is a matter of personal preference, but personally speaking, I would actually rather change the behavior of Blender so that when I press Z on my keyboard, it actually toggles this particular checkbox, as opposed to go back and forth between the wireframe mode and the solid shaded mode that is right here. So we're simply going to right click here on the little checkbox here under geometry where it says wireframe, and we're simply going to assign the shortcut Z to that, so that pressing Z will turn on or off that particular wireframe from the viewport overlay. And then, of course, if we want to see through the model, you probably noticed already at this stage, but if we press Alt Z, it allows us to see through the model. And the shortcut Z, as you can see, will still turn the wireframe on or off. It's a question of personal preference, but I prefer it this way because I like to be able to see the wireframe on top of the shaded model. But I'm not going to lie, there may be cases where I actually think that it's preferable to manually switch over to the wireframe mode that is here and then also press Alt Z to have the wireframe displayed while we also can see through the model. Okay, so if we go back within edit mode and we take a look at the UV editor that we have in greater detail, you can see that the UV editor of Blender by default is very barren. There really aren't that many options left and right. So it's actually kind of hard to know what are the functions that are at our disposal to continue working on our UVs. We have, of course, the UV menu that is right here, and in here we do have a few options here. It already kind of has the basics that you would expect there, so you can obviously manipulate UVs, you can do mirrors, you can do merge and splits and all of that, but at a minimum, what would be nice to have in here would be some type of graphical user interface, some type of GUI, that we can click in to select different options for how we want to manipulate these edges, these polygons, and these UVs. So we had to talk about two different add-ons. They're both free and they will both help you tremendously to create UVs within Blender. The first one comes packaged with Blender, so you don't have to download it from anywhere. You can simply turn it on within your add-ons. So let's go within Edit, let's go within Preferences, and within add-ons here, I'm going to do a search in here for Magic, and this will show us the Magic UV add-on. Let's turn that on. And with Magic UV that is turned on, if we go back to our UV editor, we now have a tab here on the right that is called Magic UV. And there are a lot of different options that are in here. We also have access to this if we go within Edit. And let's close our loop tools and our B surfaces. We could even offload those particular plugins at this stage. We don't need those. But we have other menus here, or other submenus, if you will, that have been exposed here that are part of the Magic UV plugin. Most of these haven't been useful for me so far, and really the reason why I'm telling you to enable Magic UV is really for one particular function, that is copy paste UVs. This particular function that is right here. And I suppose transfer UVs is also very useful. If you want to transfer UVs between two different heads, let's say, this could actually be quite useful, but they need to have the same topology. The one that is especially useful for us is copy paste UVs. And the reason why this is actually very useful is because this will actually allow us to copy UVs from one side of the face to the other side of the face. And we will do that later, okay? So there will be a chapter or a timestamp for that later on if this is something that you are quite curious about. But what Magic UV allows us, and especially this copy paste UV here, is that it will simply allow us to finish the unwrap for one side of the face, copy them over afterward to the other side of the face. And it will allow us to do that without having to split the mesh as two separate objects, mirror one object over, and then weld it back together. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's not an acceptable workflow. To have to physically split an object in two to copy its UVs over is not an acceptable workflow. And the reason for that is because we want to be able to copy UVs over from one side of the face to the other one without having to disturb the vertex order over the head that we have. There are instances where that is something that we simply cannot afford to change. Let's say that this head was getting rigged or was getting skinned by someone or had been previously skinned, and for some reason you needed to change the UVs after skinning was done. There is no way that you could actually split the object in two, because doing that would change the vertex order. Every vertex on a head has a particular number to it. They are numbered from 1 to however many vertices there are on a particular head. And if you disturb that, you will very likely completely destroy skinning or other things that have been done on a particular head. So for me, the only tools that are proper tools to mirror UVs over are tools that do not ask us to have to split the object in two and mirror that object over. We have to be able to copy the UVs from one side of the face to the other side of the face without having to disturb the vertex order. And Magic UVs and this particular copy paste option here will allow us to do that, but we will do that at a later stage. Also, keep in mind that we have modeled this head asymmetrically to begin with, and during the class on retopology, during the last one, we had made the head asymmetrical too. We had, let's say, moved the eye around so that the eye is in a slightly different position. Her right eye, as opposed to her left eye, they're slightly in a different position. The nose is slightly asymmetrical. So our mesh is not even symmetrical anymore anyway. So technically speaking, our topology is symmetrical. We have the same vertices on both sides of the face. So there is symmetry in terms of topology, but there is no symmetry in terms of vertex position. So even right now, we wouldn't even be able to split this head as two separate halves and then mirror one over the other side. Anyway, so I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole right now, although we've already gone fairly far down that particular rabbit hole there. But we'll come back on this, and I'll make sure that there is a timestamp that you can jump to during this particular class to see how we can mirror our UVs for our head without having to split it in half and do a mirror on the object itself. And that's all I want to say for this particular add-on. We won't use it beyond that during this particular class. The other add-on that we need is an add-on called Text Tools. And Text Tools is the add-on that will expose that graphical user interface within the UV editor that we so desperately need to be able to see the functions that are at our disposal to manipulate the UVs and to quickly access them without having to always go through a bunch of menus. Text Tools is also free, so we can simply go on the web, find it, and then download and install it. So in Chrome, let's do a search for Text Tools for Blender, because we have Text Tools for other software as well. Let's go to the GitHub page right here. And where it says code here, let's click on this little drop-down arrow. Let's download the zip file of this. I'm grabbing this off of GitHub to make sure that I have the latest version, because I've seen other links online to Text Tools that were not for the latest version, which at the time of recording this particular video is version 1.5. And afterward, go to your preferences, go to add-ons, go to install right here, and select the text tool zip file that you have downloaded wherever you have placed it on your computer. This will then allow us to enable UV Text Tools add-on right here by clicking on this little checkbox there. Let's close this particular window. Let me press A here once again to select everything. And now in here, you can see that we have an extra tab here on the right that says Text Tools. And that will show us a lot more options you can see here as I open these drop-down menus. There's even a tab here for baking, which we will actually use later on to bake the albedo for our head. But more on that later. What we want to do right now is to get a better visual representation for the stretching and the orientation and the density of our UVs, both in the UV editor and within our 3D window. It is extremely useful if within our 3D viewport, we can see some type of checker that will allow us to judge the density and the orientation of the UVs and also the stretching that we have over a surface. So within Text Tools, we'll simply go and click on this little checker map option that is right here. By clicking on this, you can see that the background now within our UV editor has been replaced with this kind of checker map here with these kind of little crosses everywhere. You can actually cycle through a few different checker maps by continuously pressing the checker map button that is right here. Within our 3D viewport, the color of our object has actually changed because now there is a texture that is applied to it, but because we are within solid shaded mode here, we cannot see it here. So let's switch back here over to viewport shading, material preview, and this will allow us to see the checker map that is applied on the surface of our object. By the way, if you're getting some type of Python error when you use Text Tools for the first time, you simply have to restart Blender to address that. Since we have everything here that is selected so that we can see the full UVs, kind of makes it a little bit hard here to see what is going on because the whole object is selected. So we could always here just disable the viewport overlays for now so that we can see the object without having all those polygons be visibly selected there. As you can see by default, the checker that we have is a little bit low res, and it's also way bigger than it probably should be here. If we look at these particular characters that are here, these are obviously way too big here, so it would be nice to scale these down here. And to be able to do that, we'll simply change within Text Tools here, where it says size here at 512 by default. We'll just use a different number in here. In fact, let's go up to perhaps 4K here, so 4096. Let's select that there and press checker map here once again. And now within our 3D viewport, you can see that we have a much better checker here, and it does allow us to start to really spot the places where there's a lot of stretching and where there's definitely some editing that needs to happen to the UVs to get a more uniform textile density over our head here. So these particular characters are starting to stretch here quite a lot. Same thing is happening around the mouth there. Had the ears still been merged with the rest of the face, that would be happening here as well. And take a look at the mouth back here and how incredibly stretched the UVs are in this particular zone. So we need to address all of that, of course. Now within the UV editor, I actually don't really want to see the background here of that checker map because it just makes everything kind of a little bit hard to read there. So let's just go ahead here and let's just get rid of this particular texture here from the background. What I would rather want to see here instead is a visual representation of the stretching of the polygons, and Blender has that by default, so that's really wonderful that Blender comes with this here. So within the UV editor, let's go where it says show overlays here. Click on the little drop down that is right here, and where it says UV editing, turn on display stretch. And you can choose here between angles and area. I think area is a little bit better because it shows you how much stretching there is. into all of the polygons here. And so the color allows you to see how dense the particular UVs are somewhere. The redder it is, the denser it is, and this is obviously a problem. So we kind of want the color of everything to be relatively uniform, which would be kind of blue-ish as a color. That's kind of what we want to be aiming for. Blue cyan somewhere in there. All of the zones that are red are the zones that correspond in our 3D viewport to the zones where there right now is way too much stretching. Or I suppose in this particular case, the more correct way to say it would be there's too much compression going on within our UVs, which leads to a lower than desired texel density in 3D. So this is a really, really great feedback for us to see where are the zones of improvement over our particular object. And also while we're there, let's go within our overlays yet again, and under where it says here UV opacity, we can actually switch this here from outline over to the option here called black, because I find that it just makes the rendering here a little bit less violent, perhaps. I find that outline default creates these very bold lines that are a little bit hard to read. So we can switch here over to black. And then we can also play with the UV opacity here if we want to lower a little bit the visibility of these lines here. Now that we've turned on these two add-ons, you can see if I go back to my UV menu that is right here, that we have a lot of options now at our disposal. There are quite a few options within Blender to manipulate our UVs. And there really is everything in here that you could want to be able to edit UVs. So as far as I'm concerned, Blender really is a professional UV editing tool. But because of the number of options that are in here, it will be impossible for us during this particular class to talk about all of these, but we will talk about some of these once we are improving the unwrap that we have for our head. And so we need to talk about that. But before we do talk about what needs to be improved in this particular head and how we will go about doing that, I just want to show you two options that are within Blender by default and what they do in which context they can be useful, so that you kind of have a really good picture of all of the tools that you would probably use in most cases to unwrap most things. And those two options within our UV menu are the pack islands and the average island scale. Those two options that are right here. I'd really just want to quickly talk about these so that you know what to expect out of these, because these are very useful in a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different unwrapping projects. I want to talk about average islands scale first of all. And what this does, okay, this is very, very useful, because what this does is that it will make sure that all of the UV islands that you have over a particular head all have the same relative size to each other. It's very common when we manipulate UVs to perhaps have a few of those UV islands that somehow have been scaled for some reason. Perhaps have a few of those UV islands that are way bigger than they probably should be. And if we look here within our 3D viewport, I've just scaled here one of the ears up. You can see that now the UVs that we have over one of our ears are much bigger. So the texels are much denser in that particular zone than what we have over the rest of the head. And actually, let me see if I can get a better rendering going on here. Let me turn off here the world opacity so that we're not bothered by that, and perhaps increase a little bit the strength here of our ambient light that we have in here. So you can see that the UVs here for the ear are much denser than what we have elsewhere. Let me even scale this up here even more, just for the sake of it. This is very common, okay, for this to happen sooner or later as you manipulate UVs. And the way you could fix that at a later stage is, of course, to manually take each of these UV islands and then scale them down until they seem to be at more or less the size that you want them to be. You could do that manually, of course, but if you have a lot of UV islands, that's a problem. And also you are kind of guessing how big each of these islands should be in relation to the other islands that you have. So it's not really exact. That's where the average islands function comes in handy here. You see, if I select all of the UVs that I have on this particular head, and I go to UV here and I do average islands scale, Blender will rescale all of the UV islands so that they all have the same relative size. Now, of course, on this particular ear, you can see that part of it is stretching quite a lot. So there's probably some seams that we need to add to this particular ear so that we can get a more uniform texel density over that particular ear. But what Blender has done is that it has evaluated the average texel density for this particular ear and has matched it to be the same average texel density as what we have on the island that represents the head there. So this particular option here of average islands scale is extremely useful when we are unwrapping complex objects that have a lot of different UV islands to make sure that everything winds up being at the same scale. This is usually something we want to do later on once we are relatively happy with the UVs that we have and we want to simply pack everything together. We will usually want to do an average islands scale first, and once we're done with that, then we want to do a pack islands. And let me select everything here. And then we want to do a pack islands on all of that to fit everything within our UV window here, 0 to 1 space. And at the bottom left here, you have a few options. If I open this here, we probably don't want to rotate some of these islands if we have already made sure that they were in the proper orientation. So within our pack islands here, we want to turn off rotate. And we could also play here with the margin to make sure there's a little bit more space in between these UV shells, as you can see. So I just wanted to show you these two options because they're very useful at finalizing the unwrap for a head. And if you are working on objects that are simpler, then perhaps, truth be told, this could perhaps be all that you need to do to be able to complete your UVs and then move on to something else. Of course, the problem with the pack islands is that it kind of relies on an algorithm to pack these particular islands together in what seems to make the most sense based on the algorithm. But that algorithm may not necessarily give you the most optimized result. Okay, like we can actually see in this particular case that even though we did a pack islands on this, we still wind up having a lot of dead space in a few different corners here of this particular unwrap window. If we're texturing this and we don't really care about texture resolution in the sense that we are working on an object for which we do not necessarily intend to show the unwrap, but we simply want to have something that is quick, efficient, and that allows us to move on to texturing, and we also don't really care about texture resolution. Maybe we'll like, yeah, I'll just throw a 8K texture on this, 16K texture on this. Then that pack UVs option will perhaps give you something that is already packed well enough that you can actually move on and not waste time having to manually pack the UVs together. But of course, if you're working on a production, you want to optimize as much as possible the texture space that you have. You want to reduce at a maximum the amount of dead space that you have within your UVs. So once again, if you're working on a production and you know that perhaps for a head, you won't be able to have more than, let's say, a 2K texture or 4K texture for the head. 4K texture is still pretty high res, but for modern productions, for main characters, it's not unreasonable to expect to have a 4K. Even then, okay, a 4K texture, if we have a lot of dead space within our texture sheet, that will be a pretty significant waste of memory. And we could actually get a much better result by spending some time to manually pack our UVs together. Anyway, so pack UVs, in certain cases, it works great. In other cases, it may not be sufficient to get the best possible packing for your UVs. But I want you to know that that particular option is there because there are certainly cases that you may be working on where it is totally fine to do an automatic pack of your UVs. As you can imagine, no matter how good our packing tools are, we always wind up having some dead space in different regions of our UV sheet. In just a few minutes, we'll talk in depth about what are the areas of improvement of this first unwrap. But because I want to complete the presentation of the tools that we will use, we have to talk about the tools that we will use to stretch some of these UV islands to fill in as much as possible the dead space that we have around the UV sheet. We want to straighten some of these edges here. And that will actually be very easy to do. If I do an edge selection right here, let's say that we go from, let's say, I don't know, here to here. Within our text tools here, there's actually a whole host of aligning buttons that are right here. And if I just click on this little arrow here that points towards the left, you'll see that I will be able to take all of the edges here that are on the back of the head, that create the seam on the back of the head, and I can straighten them so that they are all nice and straight. And so it's going to be very easy to take our UVs and get a very high quality unwrap that really reacquires all of the dead space under our main UV island. That's going to be very, very simple to do with all of these aligning tools. But also what's great about Blender is that it actually comes with brushes that we can use in the context of UVs to move some of these UVs around. We have brushes and we also have proportional editing, of course, or how it is more commonly called in other softwares, soft selection. If you don't know where to turn on proportional editing, it is this little button that is right here on the top here. If I actually turn this on, let's say that I click on a vertex somewhere and I press G to move that particular vertex. After I have moved that particular vertex somewhere, Then I have controls here that I can actually play with. You can see this proportional sizes right here. I can actually play with this, as you can see, to create a proportional edit or a soft selection. And I can play with the fall off here. If I want to get something, let's say smoother here would probably be a better result. So that is certainly a very nice tool. Let me do Control Z here. Let me turn it back off. You can also press O on your keyboard to enable proportional editing. And if you do turn it on before you do a particular move or scale operation, if I press G here once again, you can see that now I can actually see the radius that I had previously set here for the proportional edit. And when that is there, I can press the scroll up or scroll down on my wheel here, as you can see, to edit the size of the proportional edit as I am editing this. So I don't need to necessarily commit to the move operation before I commit to the proportional editing. And as I do this move operation, I can also press Shift O to cycle between different fall off types. But my favorite tools are definitely the move, pinch, and relax brushes that Blender comes with by default. Let me press T here to open the tools toolbar that we have on the left here. And you can see in there that we have a bunch of tools here. So we have grab, which I keep calling move. We have this relax tool here, and we have this pinch tool that is right here. So I really love these because it mimics quite a lot the sculpting brushes that we have within Blender and that we had also used in the context of retopology here. So using grab here and playing around with the brackets on my keyboard to make the radius here a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, I can also grab here, let's say this particular corner, and I can move it down. And I can, let's say, manually straighten some of these here. Perhaps squish in a little bit the back of the skull. And in this case too, of course, we also have access to fall off. So we can also change the fall off on this particular grab brush here. Let's go to Tool, and within fall off afterward, you'll see that we have a fall off profile here that we can also change. So if we want something that, I don't know, it's on sharp right now, which certainly works well in certain cases. Smoother also works quite well in other cases here. So of course, the fall off has a pretty major influence on the kind of result that you will get. And so this particular grab brush is really, really fantastic to do these kind of smudging around of our UVs. And we also have the relax here that is quite similar to the slide relax brush that we had been using in the context of retopology, of course, which allows us, as you can see, to relax the UVs. For the relax, there's really two modes, okay? There's the mode here that is called Laplacian, and then there is HC. Not sure which one is actually there by default, but regardless, they both have their uses. You'll see that we'll toggle back and forth between these when we improve this particular head. I do find that the HC one works slower, so it's not relaxing as quickly as Laplacian does. And it kind of gives us a different result here, especially around borders, as you can see. As I do a kind of bit of a relaxing here, we're getting all these UVs here for the bottom of the neck here. If I show you within 3D space, what this actually looks like. You can see that it's kind of creating all this kind of very ugly stretching here with the open border. But Laplacian doesn't actually do that. It does a much better job at actually preserving, or actually, maybe not. Actually, before we do that, let's actually turn on here lock borders. So if I turn on lock borders right here so that the border of our UVs do not actually move as we do this relax operation. This Laplacian here, you can see, it seems to simply deal better with the borders of our UVs here. You can see it's actually giving us quite a nice relaxation in this particular zone. Whereas the HC that we had, you can see it will have a tendency, as we have said, to kind of, for some reason, just compress the last poly loop that we have at the bottom of our neck here for some reason. But in certain cases, I find that HC kind of gives me a slightly better result. Other cases, Laplacian gives me a slightly better result. We'll toggle back and forth between these. And I suggest that you do the same. Just experiment with these. And if one doesn't give you quite the result that you want, try the other one. Perhaps it's going to work better. The pinch here is kind of interesting. Can come in handy in certain cases. I guess we'll see how it goes. Of course, since I am using a mouse here, you can see that the influence here is very, very strong the moment that I simply click somewhere. So that's obviously a problem. So we definitely want to reduce the strength here on this particular pinch brush here. And if I do lower the strength value here, you can see that it's a little bit gentler, I think. But it can help to just compress the UVs somewhere, perhaps a little bit. And in fact, if we hold control, we will actually magnify instead. So that can definitely be very useful. Perhaps in the context of the nose here, if we want to make some of these UVs a little bit bigger there, I can actually perhaps scale this up here a little bit, and then afterward do a little bit of relaxation. on top of this here, and you can see that we can actually easily scale up all of the UV vertices that we have around the nose here relatively easily with this particular pinch brush, holding down Control, doing a little bit of magnify, and then afterward doing a little bit of relaxation on top. So I really, really like these particular brushes. And with that being said, that's enough information about the tools. I'll just re-unwrap this so that we kind of reset these UVs. Let's switch gears here a little bit and simply take the time to evaluate the automatic unwrap that we have and really figure out what are the key zones of improvement on it. And then we'll grab all those tools that we have talked about and we will simply go to town on this. We're not going to take any shortcuts here, and we will seek to optimize these UVs as well as we possibly can. So that's really point number one of what we want to improve upon this particular unwrap. All of the dead space that is right here under the main UV island of the face, if you will, we can reclaim all of that space simply by taking the corners of the unwrap and stretching them until they are at the corners of the 0 to 1 space of our unwrap window. In the process of doing that, we will have to straighten all of these edges. We also want these UVs to not be slightly rotated the way that they currently are. And you can see that even if I try to rotate these so that the center line here running down the face is nice and vertical, we still have some degree of asymmetry within the UVs. So of course, we want to also symmetrize these UVs as much as possible. So what we're going to do then to improve these particular UVs will be to first to take all of these UV islands here, so the mouth bag, the eye bags, the ears, we're just going to move them out of the way, and we're really going to maximize the space that the main UV island takes. So we're really going to scale it up as much as it is possible. And because this main UV island isn't perfectly square, as you can see, it is slightly rectangular. Even if we try to maximize the amount of space that this occupies within our texture sheet, we're still going to have some amount of dead space over the main UV island within our texture sheet. And that will be the space that these other UV islands will be able to occupy after the fact. So those are all areas of improvement that are probably relatively intuitive for you, but it doesn't mean that our work is going to stop there, because once we have optimized as much as possible the space occupied by this main UV island, and probably before that we move these other UV islands to fill in the dead space that will remain after that, there is another thing that we have to improve. In fact, you could really say that there's kind of two main things, I suppose, that we really have to improve afterward. One is, of course, that we have to minimize as much as possible the variation in texel density that we have over the main UV island. So everywhere where our unwrap is becoming sort of orange, red, it means that the UVs there are getting quite compressed, which in turn means that we have a lower texel density in those zones. So we want to uniformize that as much as possible, of course. So we will seek to do that, of course. We will take the region of the nose, we'll take the region of the mouth, we'll try to make them a little bit bigger so that their texel density becomes a little bit more uniform with what is going on elsewhere around this particular UV island of the face. There is something else that is even more important for us to do. What's the zone of this particular head that really has the highest value for us, where we really truly want to maximize the texel density? It is certainly not on the neck, and you can see here that we have texels here that are much denser than what we have over the mask of the face. The zone of the neck certainly is not as important as the mask of the face, if you kind of think about it, right? And that's also true for the skull and the back of the neck, right? So if you actually kind of think about it right now, the most important zone of the face where we really want to have the densest texels that we possibly can get is for the mask of the face, right? This is the zone that, let's say, the player is the most likely to see, or the viewer if we're making a portfolio piece and this is not for a game. The mask of the face is the place of the texture that we really want to maximize the density of texels as well as we possibly can. This is actually the zone where we actually right now have the lowest texel density in a way. If you look at the texture sheet and you kind of imagine that, let's say at this particular scale, okay, if you kind of imagine that this texture was, I don't know, let's say that this was a 4K by 4K texture that we had over this particular face right now. Let's say that that's the kind of texture that we wind up having for our face in the end. The region that the mask of the face actually takes from that 4K texture, how big is it really? Is it 50% of the texture? I don't think it's even that. Let's actually take this particular island here and let's just move it in the lower left corner, and we kind of look at how much texture space this is actually currently taking. This is taking about like, I don't know, maybe like a third, maybe like 40% from the 0 to 1 space on the x-axis, and maybe it's taking about a third of the space from the 0 to 1 space on the y-axis there, right? So we're kind of not even taking like a third of the texture for what is arguably the most important part of the face. Even if we throw a 4K texture on this and we do not do any other further optimizations, and our UVs kind of more or less look like this, the mask of the face would probably have the equivalent of, I don't know, a texture that would be somewhere between a 1024 texture and a 2K texture. So that's a problem. It's a huge waste of memory, of course, but it also means that even if we bake out a huge texture, we'll probably struggle getting a good enough resolution on this particular head. In fact, we can't even see what will be the exact pixel sizes on this particular texture because we have here a 4K texture that we have applied. So we currently have a 4K texture that is applied on this particular head. Now, if I zoom in, you can see that the pixels here, you can kind of see them, but they're looking a little bit blurry. So let's go within the material properties of this particular object and within our texture settings here, the texture that is currently applied. Where it says linear here, we'll just set this over to closest, which means that we will see the exact pixels without any type of filtering on the texture. I have a 4K texture applied on this particular head right now, and even at this level of zoom, we can see the individual pixels that are over the nose right now, right? That's really, really, really bad. So there's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done on this particular head. But even if I zoom in here a little bit, at this level of zoom, I can clearly see all of the pixels around all of these characters that I have over the face right now. So really, a 4K texture probably wouldn't even be enough to get some really nice, sharp details, considering how small is the area that the mask of the face currently takes within our texture sheet. We need to make the mask of the face a lot bigger in relation to the rest of the head on our texture sheet. And we'll have to fight the tools, the unwrapping tools of Blender, because this is the result that the unwrapping algorithm has given us, where everything is balanced to be at the best possible average size that it can be, considering the curvature of the surface in 3D space. We want to take this region of the unwrap and we really want to scale this up here. And obviously we're going to do a better job than this, but we have to scale this up so that the mask of the face takes a much bigger portion of the texture sheet that we have. Once we have scaled up the mask of the face so that it takes a little bit more space in here, then we'll adjust the rest of this particular UV island so that it fits within the remaining space of our texture. And after that is done, then we will take the other UV islands that we have and we will fit them within the dead space that will remain above our main UV island. And the last thing that we'll seek to improve on this particular head, of course, is that we will want to reclaim a little bit of the space here that is the dead space within the inside of the mouth. And we will also want to close the eyes as well. As we are doing that, we will evaluate what it actually looks like in 3D to make sure that, first of all, we're getting the straightest possible edges here, or I suppose these are just arbitrary line within the textures, but we'll try to straighten these as much as we possibly can. Once we're relatively happy with the work that we have done, then we will do a mirror on top of our UVs so that the final UVs that we have are perfectly symmetrical, or at least as symmetrical as they possibly can be. Let's go to town on this. There's a few different ways we could actually deal with the fact that we want the mask of the face to be a little bit bigger. Either we already fit neatly the corners of our UV islands within the corners of our texture sheet. Either we do that and then we slowly scale up the mask of the face and deal with the stretching that it's going to create here. Or alternatively, I could actually scale this up right now until I get to the size that I want it to be. And then I could squish in the corners of the textures. Doesn't really matter which one that we do, but I actually kind of feel better here about manually scaling this up first. So I guess I kind of want these UVs to be as big as this. I mean, the mask of the face will always take only a fraction of the texture, of course. We have to accept that. But I think in this particular case, this should be pretty good here. In fact, if I was to move this again within the lower left corner just to kind of imagine how much texture space this is taking here. So we're taking a little bit more than half of the 0 to 1 space on the x-axis, and perhaps a little bit less than that on the y-axis, but that will always kind of be the case, I believe. So I think this is good enough. So let's move this until it is about here. So I definitely want to keep enough dead space on the top to be able to fit in the other UV islands that we have. And I don't know yet how big these will have to be. In fact, actually, we could guess that right away to make sure that we already have enough space in here. So let me actually just perhaps take the mouth bag and add 1 or 2 more seams in here. So we'll already kind of guess the amount of space that we need for all of this. Doesn't matter that much where you put your seams, your extra seams on top of this, because by and large it is inside the mouth, of course, so it doesn't matter that much, I suppose. But let me turn on my viewport overlays, of course, so that I can actually see through the model in this particular case, and I can see where the edges are. Okay, so we have our seams that are here. We can see where they currently are. I suppose the easiest thing I could probably do for this mouth bag would be to take the edge that runs down the center of the mouth bag, so this edge right here, and perhaps do a split on top of this, but not on the portion of the edge that is on the back here. I think we want to keep that merged. So actually, let me select this edge right here. Let's see, this one here. If I was to zoom in within the mouth bag, maybe this would be a little bit easier to understand what is going on, in fact. Here we go. Okay, so from this particular edge here, let me do a shortest path selection to the back of the mouth bag. So this one here, press UM, mark that as a seam. Let's do the same thing on the other side. From this edge here, all the way to the corner of the mouth there. Also mark that as a seam. So that should be a lot better. Take this particular UV island now. Let's re-unwrap it. Yeah, so that already looks a lot better. I want to get rid of all the stretching that I possibly can on all of these UV islands so that we can kind of try to pack them already. Okay, so for the ears, it would definitely be simpler actually to turn on UV sync selection back on. It just makes it easier to add our seams, of course. So let me turn on my viewport overlay here yet again. Where should we add our seams around here? We have to deal with the fact that the outside here, the helix of the ear, you can see how we're definitely getting some much lower texels in this particular zone. So we definitely have to deal with that somehow. One thing we could do is just detach the back of the ear. So actually split our ears in two. It wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. In fact, if I was to select this particular edge here, do a shortest path selection, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, I think. What I'm doing here, so what I'm doing right now isn't necessarily the end-all be-all of seams for the ear there. There's a whole host of ways that you could actually do that. But I think this would actually get us much further along. In fact, one thing I could do is perhaps deselect some of these edges here. So keep some of these here welded. I don't think I need to completely separate the back of the ear. And so let's see what we're actually getting here. Okay, that's awkward. This is probably because of the UV sync selection here once again. So now let's turn UV sync selection off. Let's reselect everything within our 3D viewport. Then press L here, select only the UV island for the ear. Scale this down here a little bit. You can see because of this particular checker that we currently have. This is why I really prefer this particular checker than the other checkers that comes with text tools, because this one actually allows us to very clearly see what is the orientation. And if we have something that is mirrored, let's say, we can actually easily see it here. So here I could actually just scale down here yet again until we flip this. And now you can see in our 3D viewport that these have now the proper orientation. They are not flipped anymore. So that's a lot better. This is quite consistent. Perhaps the only place that we could improve this, if you take a look around the ears, you can see that our helix here is a lot more balanced in terms of textile density with the rest of the ear, so that's really wonderful. It's becoming a little bit denser here, perhaps towards the inside of the ear here. I'm not sure that I necessarily mind that. What I don't want to create, though, is any kind of zigzagging or staircasing, you know. I could add a cut here, then add a cut like this within our UVs, but it would kind of give us this kind of weird kind of zigzag, kind of staircased seam that I'm not sure that I really like here. I think I'm completely fine with these ears like this. There's a little bit of imbalance in terms of textile density, but it's nothing that would actually create a problem later on, I think. And of course, as much as possible, I kind of want to minimize the amount of seams that I have around the ear. So truth be told, I think I'm actually quite fine with this. Yeah, I'm pretty fine with this. Okay, let's actually do the same on the other side. And finally, the other UV islands that we haven't addressed are the eye bags. So there too, perhaps it is worth to add a few seams on there. Let's actually take a look here to see how it is stretching. Unless our character somehow loses an eye, truth be told, we probably won't really see these polygons ever. When we were doing root topology, we were talking about the fact that they're there really just as a safety measure in case that somehow we have a little bit of a gap between our eyeballs and our eyelids, which really shouldn't happen, but may actually happen. And also to keep the mesh completely watertight. So those are the two reasons why. Where could we actually add our seams then? Let's turn UV sync selection back on. This here, I think I definitely need to split these UVs here. Perhaps even select the edge here on the inside. You can see that we do not have one nice edge loop that goes from the corner of the eye all the way to the back. Perhaps we could actually add one of these zigzag seams here. It really doesn't matter since, as we said, the inside of the eye bag is a very low priority for us. Okay, so let's just add our seams here and see what this actually looks like afterward. Yeah, see, this is nice and uniform. So sure, the seam here isn't necessarily the prettiest, but it is totally acceptable in this particular context. All right, let me just do the same on the other side. And there we go. We can turn UV sync selection back on. And I believe that's all the seams that we need to add. You can see that all my UV islands now all have very different sizes, of course. So of course, let's just select everything that we have within our UV window. Let's go to UV. Let's do a average islands scale on top of this. Just to make our life easier here, why don't we also do a pack UVs at the same time? And while I am doing that, let me actually turn off the rotate here. Cool. Okay, so this gives us a pretty good idea of the kind of negative space that we'll need to fit all of these UV islands in there. The biggest UV island after the face is the mouth bag, of course. It's definitely not necessary for the mouth bag to take as much space as it is currently taking because this is the inside of the mouth. So we could definitely scale this down just to make sure that it is a little bit more optimized there. So let me just scale this down here a little bit and then also just do a 90-degree rotation on this. One thing that we do want to pay attention to at this particular stage, okay, is as much as possible, we want all these UV islands to all be oriented in the same way as much as possible. If you look at the checker that we currently have, you can kind of read the text in the same direction. You can see that the ears, they're slightly rotated a little bit, but the text is still kind of in the same orientation as what we have for the rest of the face there. So what we don't want to have in this particular stage is something that's kind of like this here. To have one ear that's kind of rotated kind of weirdly like this with a different orientation than the rest of the face. For organic models, it's not the end of the world, but for other models, this could actually be a big problem. The reason why you want as much as possible for all your UV islands to all be oriented the same way is because it's very common to tile detail maps over the surface of a model and to perhaps apply that detail map only on certain zones of the model using a mask, let's say. But so let's say that you imagine that this was, this was a shirt for some reason. The orientation of the UVs will actually dictate the orientation of the grain of the detail map that you are applying on the surface afterward. In the context of a shirt, it probably would be fine for some of these UV islands to be rotated, if I think of, let's say, the sleeves. But the point being that the orientation of the UV islands will dictate the orientation of the grain for any detail map that could be tiling over the surface of an object. And so it is good to think about that when we are orienting these particular UV shells. Of course, we can also do something like use a second UV set here if we wanted to tile detail maps, and certainly in the context of games, that is very common to do that, to tile detail maps using a second UV set, where the first UV set, you don't really care about the orientation of the shells, and then the second UV set, that's where you really care about that. problem with having a second UV set is that it is very memory intensive. If you're doing a portfolio piece, it probably doesn't really matter. If you are working on a production, that would perhaps be something that could be a problem. Maybe you do not want to necessarily have to pay the memory price of having a second UV set. Anyway, that gets a little bit technical, but the point being that if we can avoid to ever have to add a second UV set for any reason, then it is preferable to avoid having to do so. But in the context of a face, well, let's say that we are tiling, I don't know, skin pores within an engine after the fact, and we'll kind of have the same problem. If we have skin pores and some of these shells have an orientation that is very different than the other shells that we have for the head, then the skin pores here would kind of perhaps look like they're rotated at 90 degrees, right? So you kind of want to think about that a little bit. So as much as possible, I really would like for these UV shells to be oriented in a orientation that is very consistent with what is happening on the face. So for this ear, that would be about like this. And for this ear, then, that would be perhaps about like this here or so. Of course, we will symmetrize these later on. We will actually do that. For now, we're just doing this as a bit of a preview, so to speak. And I suppose for the eye bags, we could also rotate these here a little bit using the same kind of logic. This would have to be like this here. And this one would have to be like so. Okay, so this is the best case scenario. Fortunately, the ears, they kind of always fit a little bit better if they are rotated at 90 degrees. So that's going to be kind of interesting to try and fit that in there. And everything right now has the same relative scale, as we have said, though, other than for the mouth bag, of course. And the eye bags, too, we could actually scale these down a little bit. But for now, they're small enough that we can just put these on the side there. So can we already kind of fit this here? Like if I was to pack these UVs within an imaginary 0 to 1 space, how much dead space over the top of our main island would I need to fit these UVs in there? This is the back of the ear here. I think I really like the idea of splitting off the back of the ear because maybe I can rotate the back of the ears at 90 degrees. I think that would allow me to pack these UVs in a little bit tighter there. I think I actually feel kind of fine about that. To split off the back of the ear then, let me hold Control and do a right click and drag to do a lasso selection for all of these polygons here on the back of the ear. And then either I could do Alt M on my keyboard to do a split and then press Y afterward or click on selection here to split these polygons off and then press G to move these independently. Or I suppose if you want to be fancy, another thing you could do is to simply disable your sticky selection mode. Do your lasso here yet again on these polygons, and then simply press G to move these, and then to reselect shared location from your sticky selection mode. Those two ways will allow you to split off here the back of the ear. Let's do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so yeah, what I kind of have in mind is, let me just move these here out of the way, is that maybe I could actually kind of squish in the ear like this, perhaps rotate it here a little bit, something kind of like that. And then do that on both sides here. That would actually allow me to fit both ears here very nicely to the corners. And for the back of the ear here, I suppose I could probably fit them like this here. I know I've just said that it might not be desirable to have some of these UV shells at 90 degrees, but considering the fact that this is the back of the ear, I can't really see any problems that this would actually create. For the mouth back here, could actually scale it down a little bit, perhaps kind of squish it in here like this on the side, and then take our eye bags and then kind of tuck them in sort of like this. I think this would be nice and optimized. So because I'm kind of already more or less packing these in, it's just a way for me to kind of visualize how much space will I actually need for these UVs in the end, and how much dead space should I keep over the main UV island so that I can really optimize and use as much of the texture space as possible for the main UV island. All right, so we kind of expect now that we're scaling everything up, I'll need to keep about as much space as this here near the top of my UVs to fit these in here. All right, cool. So that gives me a pretty good estimate of the amount of dead space that I need to keep. And I think I'm satisfied with this. So let me just move these out of the way for now. We'll deal with these later, but so I need to keep about as much dead space as this here right now. So cool, okay. So my strategy here will be to scale up this main island here a little bit more until the mask of the face occupies as much space as I want it to occupy. So about like this here or so. Then let me move this down here a little bit so that it's kind of nicely centered on our texture sheet. And then we will simply squish in all of these UVs here. We'll see we'll have to compress the UVs here by quite a lot to be able to fit in the back of the skull within that 0 to 1 space. In fact, maybe I'm a little bit too ambitious right now. Let me scale them down. I think this should be good enough. It's going to be a very nice challenge. Let me see if I can actually have my UVs be a little bit transparent there so that I can see where my 0 to 1 space is here. Let's go to our viewport overlays. And I suppose I have to turn off stretch here if I want to be able to see where is the border here of my 0 to 1 space. Yeah, that seems pretty good to me. So our challenge then is to squish in the back of the skull, the base of the neck, squish all of that in within that nice 0 to 1 space. And at the same time, remove the stretching that we have on the lips, on the nose. Make sure that we are getting as much uniformity within the mask of the face as we possibly can. Let's start with the changes that we need to do to the cranium and the neck. Let's smush all of these in before we do any kind of work on the mask of the face, on the nose, on the lips there, because the contour of the face is probably the one that feels a little bit riskier there. We have to move these polygons quite far in, and I'm quite confident that the work that we will do on the mask of the face will go quite well here. So let's actually start by smushing in the cranium and the neck within our 0 to 1 space. We could start with these grab brushes and stuff, but actually, perhaps one thing I would actually rather do here instead is perhaps just to do a general scale. We're going to move our 3D cursor to the inside border of our selection. So I'm holding down Shift and I'm doing a right click to move our 3D cursor, so about here or so. And then from our drop-down menu here, we will select, well, I suppose it's a 2D cursor in this particular case here. So let's select 2D cursor right here. Press S, press X to do a scale like this. And let's just smush all of this in here. Let's do the same thing on the other side. We can take a look at the feedback here in the 3D viewport. You can see that these polygons are all becoming quite rectangular, but we will address that. I mean, in the end, they will always be slightly rectangular because we are smushing them in, as we have just said there. So we are compressing them a little bit, but it's a good trade-off to get more resolution on the face. So I'm actually quite happy about that. Now let's do the same thing with the vertices here that are on the bottom. Let's press Y in this particular case. Let's constrain this on the Y-axis. So about like this should be pretty good. And now let's switch over to our grab brush. The fact that the ears have been detached does help quite a lot because we don't have to deal with the ear here and making sure that the ear has a good enough resolution there. So it actually helps us to do a better job with this. And I suppose we could actually compress these down a little bit so that we get a ratio that's a little bit more square on these UVs. All right, we can now bring in our straightening tools. So let me take all of these vertices that are here. Let's go within our text tools and let's do a align here so that we are aligning and aligning here towards the bottom. I want to keep a very slight gap just to avoid having any kind of weird issues where perhaps some of these polygons could start to sample the texture that's on the top of the head if the texture is repeating or something like that. Let's do the same thing here. Let's do an alignment like so. Perhaps here I can actually move them very slightly towards the border without touching the border of our 0 to 1 space. And let's do the same thing on this side. So now we could break out the relax brush, but what I would actually rather do is to do some partial unwrapping. And what I mean by that is that we're just going to go ahead and select a bunch of vertices here. Let's take, let's say, all of these vertices here. And then let's press U twice to do an unwrap on this. And this will probably give us a better distribution for these vertices than if we were to just use a relax brush on all of these polygons. So that was for the back of the neck here. We can see the kind of result that we're getting. You can see how the UVs here are quite rectangular, they're quite stretched, and it does help to make them just a little bit more square in the process. So let's do the same on the other side. Let's take all of these. In fact, we could actually take all of that here. We just don't want to take the mask of the face, but we actually kind of want to take everything else in a way. So I'm actually going to more or less select all the vertices here. We could even try to select the vertices that are on the border. Now, sometimes it's a little bit risky, but we could give it a try, see the kind of result that we're going to get out of this. All right, that looks pretty good to me. I'm concerned about the vertices on this border, but we'll see what happens once we unwrap this again. Yeah, see, I don't like that. Okay, so that's pretty bad. So let's actually deselect these. I'm holding down Control and Shift when doing this lasso selection. So holding down Control, Shift, and then doing a right click and drag to create a lasso that will deselect vertices. It's kind of what I was talking about when I was talking about fighting the tools. You can see the kind of result that we had there when we did an unwrap, and we had some of those border vertices selected. Okay, so yeah, that's quite a lot better now. Now, you can see how some of these vertices here on the seam that's on the back of the face, you can see the kind of result that we're sort of getting here. These vertices are all sort of going a little bit diagonally down there, so that's really not great. So what we can actually do for that is do a selection on all the vertices that are on the border. And on these now, we will do an unwrap, but we will do an unwrap that will be constrained on the y-axis, or I suppose on the v-axis, since these are UVs. So within our text tools here, where it says unwrap, we can actually do an unwrap, but that is constrained on the v-axis. See the result we are getting from that? We have a better distribution now for all of these vertices, but it has not destroyed that nice alignment that we have done. We can do the same thing here with these vertices that are on the bottom. In fact, let me take all these vertices and straighten them yet again. I can see that some of these vertices are not quite aligned with each other. So we can do the same with these vertices here that are on the bottom. In fact, let me just do a bigger box selection. Select more vertices here, and then let's do an unwrap on the that is constrained on the U-axis. There you go. Slightly better distribution of UVs. We could try actually a little bit of relaxation here on these UVs. Let's try the relax brush. See where we are here. So we're in about this region here. While I do that, in fact, let me also turn on the lock borders here. I don't want to move those here. So a little bit of relaxation like that. It's possible because I'm using a mouse right now that this relax brush is perhaps a little bit too strong to begin with. Let me actually reduce a little bit its strength there. We'll have to relax for longer, but it's going to give us a little bit more control. So I think that's totally fine. Could also do it here a little bit, do it here a little bit. We are on Laplacian, which does deal better with the borders, as we have talked about before. So I think it should work pretty well. Let's take a look around. See, these are relatively square, so I'm quite happy with those. There's a little bit of a, so these UVs, these lines that we have on the textures, still would want them to be as straight as I possibly can. So this is probably one of those moments where we really just want to start to really take the grab brush and perhaps be a little bit more localized, perhaps, where we do a little bit of grab and a little bit of shifting around here of these UVs manually, just very slowly. Okay, so I want to hit this zone here. I'm looking at the 3D window while I'm doing this. And I'm just trying to perhaps pull these down a little bit so that these lines here, if I do a Control Z here, you can see I'm just, see this line here, it's kind of a little bit wobbly there, creates a very extremely shallow S, but a little bit of grab brush, you can see how now it's a little bit straighter, so that's pretty good. I know that these edges probably should be relatively straight in my UVs because they are relatively straight in my 3D window, so I could actually, in fact, if I do a little bit of relaxation here, oh yeah, see, that's actually better. Just trying to straighten out some of these edges here. I could actually really want these to nicely follow the edge loops as much as possible. It's the back of the neck, it doesn't matter that much, but why not, right? We might as well try to do the best job that we can. So all of these edges that are kind of traveling slightly diagonally down, I actually want to straighten them as much as possible, really. So let's take our grab brush here, let's turn off lock borders, just take these and perhaps move them up. You can see my fall off right now, it probably isn't great on the grab brush. I want a sharper profile, which will probably move these vertices, yeah, in a way that's perhaps a little bit more interesting. As I move these up, you can see that it's kind of doing a better job at straightening out the edges. By having these edges straight in the texture sheet, it means that the checker will more nicely follow the same orientation as the edge loops. We don't have to go crazy on this, but I think it's going to help a little bit to get a slightly better quality texture going on afterward. If I turn off my viewport overlays, yeah, see, pretty happy with the texture here. It's completely fine if some of these, if the checker goes slightly diagonally across the neck, it's totally fine. Don't go too crazy with that. Okay, this is very, very good. All right, so these polygons are pretty square on the neck. They're pretty square. Well, here they're pretty rectangular, in fact, but that's okay. It's the cranium. We don't really care. I mean, this character is going to have hair in the end, so we're not really going to see that, first of all. Second of all, even the character did not have hair. You know, if we were to actually sculpt some skin pores there, hair follicles or something, and we were to bake them out, they still would come out looking quite nice. If you sculpt all your details and you bake them out afterward, you can deal with a lot more stretching within your UVs. And of course, if you use something like Substance Painter and you project details, then that's actually the same thing. A little bit of stretching within the UVs can be very well managed because we are projecting details. And so the stretching of the UVs gets factored in. But if we are simply tiling details, let's say only using detail maps, let's say in the engine in the end, then that's where perhaps it's a little bit more critical to ensure that all of these polygons wind up being of a consistent size and removing as much as possible the stretching. I'm still not sure how we'll do the tertiary details for this particular phase. It will be the next step after this particular class. At a minimum, we'll do certainly a series of projections. Cool, okay, so this is looking pretty good for the neck, I think. Just said this side of the face here, there's a little bit of stretching in there, but we don't care about that because we will mirror that over, so we don't really care. This is the side of the face that actually matters. It's looking really good overall. I'm very happy with this. The only thing here is that if we struggle to fit in the ear, then that will make it interesting to perhaps take the grab brush and try to smush this in here a little bit more, just so that we can actually afford to have more space for the ears. That might actually happen. In fact, why don't I do that here right away? A little bit of relaxation here using Laplacian. I think I should be pretty good. Pretty happy with that. Around the border of the ears, is there anything we can do there? You can see how our checker is kind of starting to cave in here a little bit, so perhaps we can do a little bit of work there. I think we just need to move this here a little bit. So I'm doing the move in the UV window, but I am actually looking at the feedback within the 3D viewport as I'm doing that. Try and get these lines to be as straight as I can. We could try a little bit of unwrap on this after the fact. So let's do a box selection around these vertices. Let's do unwrap on this. Yeah, it does remove some of that stretching. You can see there's still a little bit of a dip here, so I just want to move these, I think, a little bit further down. I'm taking this to a degree that is slightly pedantic, okay? But I would rather do that and be a little bit too clean, so to speak, than to be a little bit too dirty as we produce a class on this. Okay, yeah, we can start to attack the mask of the face. Let's actually do a little bit of work around the eyes and the mouth. I think it's time we actually did something about those. This might be the first time ever that I actually use a Wacom tablet while doing UVs. Okay, so what we want to do for the eyes and the mouth is really just close them. Let's start with the eyes. It's probably going to be the easier one here to deal with. So I'm just going to use this brush here. Now, you could do proportional editing to close the eyes to a whole bunch of ways that you could actually do this, of course. You don't need to have a Wacom. You could just manually move some of these vertices. That would be completely fine too. I guess I have a sharper profile on this though. This is kind of weird. Considering the fact that I'm using my Wacom, let's switch over here to smoother. I think it's going to be better. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a way I can mask the bottom vertices. Unless there's a way here that I can constrain the grab brush to only the selected vertices. That would be extremely useful for us. But I don't believe that there is a way to do that. I think that would definitely be a very nice thing to add in the future, some way to create masking. Just to have a mask brush in here somewhere. That would be really, really cool, so that I could actually mask the lower eyelid while I move the upper eyelid vertices around. Because we could do that if we're using the proportional editing, because we could enable that here. Let's say we go to grab here. I press G to move this. Our proportional editing is way too big. Could be because this value is just incredibly high. I'm not sure why this value is as big as it is right now. If this was, let's say 0.1, what would this look like? Yeah, okay, so. Oh yeah, this is still way too big. Okay, so let's do this again. Let's press G. I see what's actually going on. Let's actually switch this here to be at the median point here instead. So this is the reason why this is not working the way that we want it to work here. So let's press G and then let's play around here with the radius of this here. So let's say I was to move this vertex here. Then we could actually turn on this little connected button that is right here, so that this would actually only move the vertices that are directly attached. Okay, so let's play around here with our fall off here. Let's try, I don't know, maybe a smoother fall off on this. Let's play around here with the size of this, have it a little bit bigger. Let's see how a different profile would work. That's not too bad, actually. So that sphere, I think that's actually pretty good. Let's go ahead here and just reduce the proportional size. Yeah, I like that. Really, really nice. I actually quite like that our lids here will become a little bit further apart here. That will kind of create a little bit more of a round corner here than being completely compressed together, because it will simply give a little bit more UV space to these polygons that are around the border here. You know, if we were to compress all these vertices like this, you can see that now this will definitely give us UV or triangulation problems, depending on in which direction is the triangulation going. I think too that it's probably not a good thing that I have a curve going on like this. So I want to straighten this as much as I can, really. So let's actually do that. Those sculpting brushes are actually quite nice. So I could maybe do something kind of like this here. And even in fact, if we kind of follow the natural angles that we have on the eye here, if I look at the lower eyelid from this particular angle like that, it's completely fine if there's a slight dip like that is kind of happening. So if I kind of dip the UVs here down a little bit, it just makes it a little bit more consistent with what is happening in the 3D window. I want to have a fair amount of resolution to the caruncles, because if you look at the 3D volumes that we have here, there's actually quite a lot of variation in the volumes. It can be very easy to have a bit of a pixelated mess there, especially if you kind of imagine that you, I don't know, somehow have a close-up on the eyes of the character, which happens quite a lot within video games, and you definitely want to have enough UVs for the caruncles so that they look nice and sharp. So perhaps this is even a zone where we kind of want to use our magnify here. So I'm going to select the pinch brush, but I'm going to hold Control. And yeah. So okay, let's just lower the strength of this brush way down. I don't mind losing a little bit of the space around the circumference of the eye if it means that I'm gaining a little bit more space for the eye. I think that's a pretty good trade-off, so we can make the caruncles here a lot bigger. We could still probably get some eyelids that are a little bit more straight than this. Ideally, what we want is for these lines that we have to simply travel very nicely, uniformly across the eyelid. That's how we can really get the best possible UVs in this particular case. It's going to remove as much as possible of that distortion. Why not use a straighten tool then, right? Let's go within our text tools. Let's do a line here towards the top. Oh, let's get rid of this one. Just like that. And then let's do the same thing with these here. And let's do the same thing with this one here. And then why not take all of these yet again, and let's do an unwrap. What I just did here, I kind of want to do it on the bottom edge as well. All right, let's break out our relax brush. Let's get an AK checker map on this. Even then, maybe we could get something that's even a little bit smaller than this. Why not? Okay. Within our material parameters then, let's go within base color right here. And where it says vector here, let's load in here a vector map. where it says add right here, let's go ahead and select a multiplication. Multiply right here. For the vector 1 here, it will be the UV map. And our vector 2 here, let's set this to, I don't know, let's say, I don't know. Let's go crazy here. Let's go like 10 and 10. Yeah, okay, maybe that's too small. But yeah, so we actually want to have a little bit of a compression here built into the UVs when the eye is open, so that when the eye closes, that will have a very nice square shape. When I do a relax here, you can see it's actually helping in this particular case. So we've made the caruncles much bigger so that we can have a lot sharper details in that particular zone. And you sort of expect the player camera at some point to get really close to this and to really see the shape of the caruncles. You kind of expect to have these very nice close-ups in modern video games. So we want to make sure that at whichever resolution our textures are, that this will hold up quite nicely. But of course, we want to kind of diffuse a little bit more the distortion that we'll be building around the particular caruncle there. Let's actually just get our AK texture back. So let's just put the multiplication values here back to 1. I might be getting a little bit too ambitious with the size of these caruncles, and I've built in so much stretching within the UVs that I think I should probably try to do an overall relax on the whole contour of the eye. Actually, yeah, that's actually a pretty good idea because I actually don't mind having a little bit more dead space here within the eyes there, but just only very so slightly if it actually kind of rounds out the corner here a little bit, which I kind of like. Because I think that we should indeed relax these here a little bit. Yeah, something like this. I think this is pretty good. Just a little bit of relaxation on this, I think. It's a pretty good idea. I mean, we've been moving things left and right manually, so of course at some point we're bound to build in there a little bit of distortion, you know? Kind of like how this line kind of nicely follows the eye, as you can see, and it kind of turns with the caruncles. In fact, if we can get it to follow even more nicely the caruncles, I think that's going to be pretty cool. So in the end, we've lost a little bit of the resolution that we had added for the caruncles, but because we made them so much bigger at the beginning, we'll have retained a lot more of the bigger shape than had we never built that into the first place. But I feel as if we need to kind of get rid of what is happening here. I don't really like the shapes that we have there. Maybe I just have to move this manually a little bit. Try to get some straighter lines there. See, that's a lot better. Okay, let's do a little bit of work around the mask of the face, around the outside corner of the eye here. Let's do a little bit of relaxation on there, and let's see if we can get some straighter lines going on within this texture that we have here. I'm just using a combination of grab and relax to try and get some of these lines to be as straight as I can, while also trying to minimize the amount of distortion that is kind of built in. These two things are sometimes not compatible, trying to make lines straighter, but also remove the distortion. Sometimes they kind of ask you to go in two different directions there. So you kind of have to find something that's a little bit in between. The lower lid doesn't close really all that much when a character closes their eyes there. So it's not really a lid that moves all that much like the upper lid does. So we don't really need to try and build in there a little bit of rectangularness, if you will, within those texels in that particular spot. We can keep them very nice and square. And the outside corner of the eye is definitely a zone where we want to spend quite a lot of time to really remove as much of this distortion as we can, because we are forcing in there a little bit for the eyes to be closed within the UVs, of course. But right now, our character has their eye open. So, of course, the geometry, the 3D geometry doesn't quite match what we are building with the UVs here. So we really want to be careful here and practically move every vertex one at a time to try to really minimize as much as possible all of the distortion that is within this particular zone. You can see I have a bit of a downward curve here on the brow bone if you look at the texture. So we want to try to pull on these UVs to try and get those lines to read as straight as they possibly can. So I'm pulling in the 2D window, but I am looking at the feedback in the 3D view to see in which direction I should be pulling my UVs to try and get the straightest possible lines. And always after doing a move like this, you want to go back on top with the relax brush and just do a very slight amount of relaxation. Or you could also try unwrapping. See, those are starting to look a lot straighter there, so that's pretty cool. Overall, this is, I think this is working really, really well. All right, let's take care of the nose next, because the nose won't be that complicated, and we'll finish the mask of the face by tackling the mouth here. First thing I want to do here is just do a really big box selection around all the vertices here. I'm going to try not to touch the nostrils for now, but at least for all the vertices that are over the ball of the nose here. And let's just try to do an unwrap on this to see the kind of result that we get from that. Yeah, you can see that this is pretty much the optimal unwrap that we're going to get. So I don't think that unwrapping is really going to help us here. I believe relax will probably give us a much better result though, because what relax will do is that it will simply spread out all of the compression that is happening here over a bigger zone. So we're going to get something that's more uniform in terms of vertex distribution. Let's give that a try. As I do this here, you can see how we are pulling some of these vertices up, and we are getting something that is a lot more consistent in terms of UV size here. Look at the nose in the 3D viewport. This is already a huge upgrade. If I do too much of this relaxation though, you can see that some of these zones are starting to stretch quite a lot. So we are, even though we are relaxing, we're actually adding distortion if we kind of look at these lines. So we want to be aware of that. You don't want to relax everything all of the time. You really have to pay attention to what it's actually doing. I feel like the nostrils here, the corner of the nostrils may be a little bit tricky, but I mean, at the same time, we're really not far from where we want to be in this particular zone. So perhaps just one or two unwrap in this particular zone is going to be enough to get us a very nice and clean result. Just doing a localized unwrap like this really helps to remove some of the distortion that the relax has been building in. So I probably want to do an unwrap here too, although I want to be wary that if I do an unwrap over a zone that's a little bit too big, you'll see that I'll start to wind up with a result that's going to start to compress here yet again. So yeah, sometimes on certain vertices it works great. On other vertices, it does the opposite of what we actually wanted to do. I wonder if there's a way to bring even more resolution to the tip of the nose, perhaps by smushing some of these vertices around. Let's say the vertices that are under the nose there, they probably don't matter nearly as much as the ones that are on the tip of the nose. So perhaps there's actually a way for me to gain a little bit of that space for the tip of the nose. See, just like that. And I'm winding up having lines that are nice and straight within the 3D viewport, so that's quite nice too. Now vertically though, the vertical lines, they will always give us something that's rectangular because we have to accommodate for the size of the nose, of course. So there's really nothing we can really do about that. And it's completely fine if there starts to be quite a lot of compression within the nostrils themselves. We won't really want to texture the inside there. It'll probably wind up being some type of solid color in the end, so we don't need to worry about that too much. You can also see some of the triangles of the loras. If we kind of look at the nose from this particular angle here, like this is a triangle that's kind of creating this kind of ugliness there. Some of these vertices may actually need to be moved a little bit, in fact. Yeah, actually, some of that is within the mesh directly. All right, so this is looking better from a modeling standpoint. I have a little bit of wobbliness here that I would like to get rid of, so let's see if a little bit of relaxation is going to do that for us. And I could also try a localized unwrap on this. Else I might have to just tweak some of these vertices. See, so something kind of like that. I think this is as good as we're going to get the tip of the nose. Bear in mind, her face is asymmetric and her nose is especially asymmetric. When I look here within the UV editor, you can see that the symmetry line is nice and straight. So all of this kind of stretching to the side there is a result of her nose being asymmetric as far as the 3D model is concerned. Once we symmetrize the face, we'll do a very slight relaxation or perhaps a very slight unwrapping of the tip of the nose there to see if we can get these to be slightly straighter, just a little bit, which means that in the end our UVs will be slightly asymmetric, but that's okay considering the fact that her face is asymmetric. All this little wobbliness is there, just a little unwrap on top of this is all that we need to get something here that looks much nicer. So yeah, that's looking pretty good to me. I love how these lines are continuing straight across the face to the other side. The nose will always have a little bit less resolution than elsewhere. We are fitting this 3D volume onto a 2D surface within a constrained location. So, I mean, that will always happen, but at least in this case, I think we were able to get the nose slightly under control and get a better distribution of UVs than what we had before. I'm quite happy about this. Let's move on to the mouth. One thing about the mouth is that I said that I wanted to close the mouth, which is true. But at the same time, I also want to pay attention to what this character would actually look like if this character was to open her mouth. All the polygons that we have created here on the corner of the mouth, all of these would actually have to stretch. All the polygons here would all become nice and round if she was to open her mouth. So it's quite normal, like we have done for the eyes, for there to be some amount of compression built into the UVs when her mouth is closed, so that when the mouth opens, these UVs become nice and straight. So in a way also within our UVs, it's actually quite normal for her to do a little bit of an O like that with her mouth, a little bit, not as much as she is doing here. And certainly the bigger issues have to do with the upper lip and the lower lip having such an angle in there. We really want to reduce that. But for the corners of the mouth, it's actually quite normal for it to be nice and rounded like this. So we kind of have to try to close the top lip and the bottom lip, but also try not to disturb too much what is happening on the corner of the mouth right there. Okay, so we know what we're looking for, so let's go to town on this. I think there too, actually, perhaps using proportional editing as opposed to the grab brush would be the better idea. Once again, because of the fact that we cannot mask. I can't just come here with a grab brush and take the top lip and just move it down. Although, well, truth be told, it's not too bad. But you can see that when I try to close the lower lip afterward, then we are actually also hitting the top lip with the brush. Yeah, so that's why it would be really nice to have some type of masking on the grab brush, but sadly we do not have that. But actually, what I've done here, I'm actually going to keep it because this looks better already within the 3D viewport. A little bit of relax here. Let's see the kind of result that we're getting from that. Ideally, as much as possible, we really want this kind of checker to really continue nicely across. So we don't really want to have a bit of a dip like that. It's not really nice. So I'm not sure that relaxation is going to give us the kind of result that we want, but let's try and unwrap again of this of these particular polygons or of these particular UVs. I will pay the price for the fact that we have continued the UVs within one edge loop on the inside. I will definitely pay the price for that because we have to fit that particular extra poly loop within our UVs. It's going to reduce slightly the amount of UV space that I have for the outside of the lips. So hopefully that's not a mistake. But we'll see how it goes. If it really becomes a problem, perhaps we will detach that inside poly loop and perhaps we will include that within the UVs of the mouth bag. We'll see how it goes. But I feel as if we are already quite close. You know, like looking at this within the 3D viewport right now, I don't feel as if there's actually that much that needs to change. We want to, of course, densify a little bit the texels that we have on the lower lip here and perhaps even on the top lip a little bit. But truth be told, they're already quite close to what I expect them to be. So I think it's already, we are already falling into more of a polish stage, I think, with these than with any kind of really heavy kind of work. I said that the eyes would be a little bit easier than the mouth, but I'm actually starting to think that the mouth will be a lot easier than the eyes there, because we had to work quite a lot to get the UVs of the eyes to look like these. And they look quite good too, by the way. I'm very, very proud about these. These might be the best UVs I've done for eyes so far. Yeah, so I think what I want to do with the mouth is kind of the same thing as we have done with the eyes. Like, let's start by just closing off the negative space that we have here, and perhaps to take all of these UVs that we have here and maybe let's straighten them as a pretty good starting point here. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do a straighten here towards the bottom. So it's going to straighten based upon the lowest vertex that is currently selected. Let's do the same thing with the lower lip. So these are the vertices that are creating the border of the lip here, where the lips actually meet. So I think those two, I actually want to straighten those out. We might have to manually build the corner here of the mouth. I'm kind of tempted to do that, in fact. Perhaps unwrapping would give us something nice here, but I kind of have my doubts. Yeah, no, see, that does not work. What about this here? That's even worse. Okay. Yeah, there's really nothing we can do here. We have to manually build this particular zone. Oh, actually, one more thing I want to do. Let me take all of these UVs that we have straightened, and let's do a straighten on the U, or rather an unwrap on the U in this particular case. And yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, yeah, so let's just build this here manually, really. It wouldn't be a bad idea to also pay attention to which is the loop that goes directly in the middle of the top lip and the lower lip. Let me see if we can actually just grab it here very quickly. So which one is it? It's this one here. Makes it kind of hard, right, to see what is happening. Actually, let's turn on sync selection. We can actually see which is that loop. So here we go. It's this particular loop that is right here. It's not a bad idea to perhaps do a little bit of work with UV sync selection that is turned on. In this particular case, it will actually allow me to see better where is the wireframe and the loops that I am selecting. So yeah, I haven't really been going back and forth between UV sync selection on or off, but it's not a bad idea to turn it on back once in a while so that I can actually see where are the vertices here that I want to click on within the 3D window. It's not a bad idea to do that. But I really wish that those two modes would be combined. I kind of hate the fact that UV sync selection is even a thing, to be honest. I mean, I would usually rather want to work with UV sync selection that is turned on, but all of the other unwrapping tools would have to work in this particular workflow. You can see that our UV layout here, most of these tools do not actually work when we have UV sync selection that is turned on. Well, that's really terrible. And yeah, you can see that our unwrap definitely does not work either with UV sync selection that is turned on. We have a much better display within the viewport, but unfortunately we lose a lot of those nice tools. So yeah, that kind of sucks. This is definitely one of the weaknesses of Blender's UV editing, which does really suck, because truth be told, I actually think that in general that Blender's UV editor is actually quite good. Like, we have a lot of very nice things in here. I like this particular stretch map that is here. A lot of these tools that we have, because text tools are actually quite nice. The unwrapping algorithm feels pretty good. So there's really a lot to like about unwrapping with Blender, but it's not perfect. I think Maya is probably the software that gives me the most flawless unwrapping experience. But I also want to say that I think that Blender actually comes as a nice second there. And it's definitely good enough. You know, for free software, it is absolutely amazing. You can absolutely do professional work with Blender's UV unwrapping. But at the same time, I wouldn't tell someone to go and buy Maya just for the unwrapper, you know, unless they have money to spare. I've made a pretty good point when we were modeling this to try and keep all of these edges to always be nicely spaced out as much as possible. So I feel actually quite confident that if I do the same thing here within the UV editor, that we're going to wind up having a very high quality unwrap in the end. What would our relax tools give us? Yeah, that's not bad actually. Kind of like this. A little bit of relax here I think is actually quite nice. We can get those edges to have a very nice and uniform curve, and so I actually quite like that. The look in 3D, that looks really good to me. We have to accept that there will be a slight amount of staircasing like this. Of course, we always want to reduce it as much as we can. But considering the fact that we are kind of forcing the UVs here in a particular configuration that is very different than what we have in 3D, we also have to accept that there will be a slight amount of staircasing happening. But the idea is that when the character opens her mouth, that staircasing probably will disappear quite a lot. But yeah, truth be told, one of the problems with the unwrapping editor in this particular case is that I can't actually see where these vertices are. You know, like I would like to actually pinpoint some of these vertices exactly. And the only way we can actually kind of do that is by turning UV sync selection back on. And then turning our overlays here back on and be like, okay, so which is the vertex? Say I want to select this particular vertex that is here, you know. So let's actually select it. We can see in 3D where that is. It's actually further on the outside than I actually thought. So it's good that I have selected it. And then afterward, let's turn UV sync selection back off. Let's reselect it here. One thing I could do here actually is could actually take this vertex here, move it down so that we get a nicer curve here. Because of course, even if I get very nice consistent curves in my unwrapping window, if I don't have the same curves in 3D, I'm obviously going to wind up having a little bit of staircasing. But it's only worth to worry about that so much, you know, at some point. That's just the nature of an organic 3D model. You know, I want to say once again, it's not necessary for most 3D models that you'll make to go to this level of detail. If you're kind of watching this and kind of thinking that, oh my God, I need to do this all of the time for all the 3D models, and unwrapping is so complicated, and oh my God, like I can't believe that people do this all of the time. Well, people don't usually do this all of the time. This is really just because this is a face. But even then, you know, you kind of want to think about like in which context will this face be used. You know, in the context of a class, I want to be extremely clean here with the UVs that I'm creating, but in a lot of other contexts, I would probably just do a quick unwrap and look at the result. And if the result looks nice and stretchless, probably keep that, you know. If you're going to make your own topology that you will afterward use across a lot of different faces, a lot of different projects, then as we have said, it's not a waste of time to spend this time to make some really nice UVs if you are going to reuse what you have done here across many different projects. But yeah, I will accept that this zone here, it's going to look a little bit mushed. There's nothing we can really do about that. And if we were to subdivide this face, also a lot of this staircasing would actually disappear because we would simply have more polygons. We need to do a little bit of relax on this. Oh yeah, that's nice. For the top lip, we have some more work to do, of course. Let's try and unwrap on that. Very nice. One thing that's worth to think about with the mouth in this particular case is whether it makes sense to perhaps take a grab brush here and really pull on the corner of the mouth towards the outside here. If you look at the result in 3D, look at these particular lines that we have on the texture there. If I actually pull on the corner of the mouth towards the outside, and perhaps I can even play here with our fall off, perhaps try a sharper fall off just for the sake of it. Yeah, see how I can try to maybe get these to be a little bit straighter. Of course, it's kind of destroying a lot of the work that we have done. But if it means that we have slightly more resolution for the lips, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. And here, yeah, I'd be interested to also perhaps pull here on the lower lip towards the bottom within the UV editor, try to there to perhaps get a little bit more of those texels going on the lower lip. Our lips are now a little bit more consistent with what is happening elsewhere. Feels like a big change that perhaps we should have done earlier, but it doesn't really matter too much as long as the result is the good result in the end. It's just a little bit of wasted time, really. But okay, so let's do a little bit more unwrapping then. Although unwrap will want to compress the lower lip here. So I don't want to do too much of that. I have to actually be kind of wary about that. Might not be the better tool to use here. In some zones like this here, if I take a few of these vertices right here, you can see in the 3D viewport there's a little bit of that zigzagging that's kind of going on here. But if I do an unwrap that is constrained to the U axis, I can actually clean some of that up here. One thing I could try is to bring a few more of those texels that we have under the jaw and perhaps within the neck, perhaps bring some of those texels to be part of the chin. So I could actually take my grab brush here and try to grab the zone of the chin, perhaps the zone of the underjaw, and pull it down here a little bit, which in turn will bring a little bit more texels towards the chin. Of course, the neck will always look like it's denser because it's a cylinder of a smaller radius than what the head is. Of course, the neck will always be denser. Okay, let's take a look at the ears if there's anything interesting that we can do about that. Let's see if there is a way to perhaps get something slightly more uniform. But I really don't want to have to add any more seams to this. That's the problem. So this might actually be quite hard. This is already really, really good, to be honest. So really probably isn't much need to do any kind of work on this. If I can just pull this towards the outside, I'm probably going to get a little bit more of those texels going on for the helix. It's kind of a way to bring a little bit more resolution to that zone. I kind of doubt we'll be able to use any kind of relaxation within the ear. Yeah, doesn't work all that great. So really, I think our only tools are this grab brush, and perhaps we could try unwrapping. But there too, I feel as if we unwrap after we have stretched, the unwrap is going to try to bring us back to our starting point. So there might not be much that we can do here. It's already a little bit better. I mean, this is definitely good enough. So yeah, these UVs are pretty good overall. I think we're ready to do the mirror. I've been holding you in suspense for long enough. So within our 3D viewport, let's make sure we're in polygon mode in this particular case. I'll turn my viewport overlays back on here as well. Let me hold Alt and middle click until we are looking at the face from straight on. Let me turn on X-ray. Let me turn on wireframe. Kind of hate seeing the grid though. Let me get rid of that here. So I really just want to do a selection of the side of the face that I want to copy the UVs over to the other side of the face. And I want to make sure to be very precise with the selection that I'm doing. So I really want to make sure that I'm selecting all of the polygons that is on one side of the face. So let's use our select box in this particular case. Let me do a box selection of all the polygons on this particular side. And let me really zoom in to make sure that I really have caught everything, because you can see that some of these polygons have not been selected. All of these polygons here. Yeah, see, so that's a perfect selection for one side of the face. And then within our Edit tab here, let's go to Copy Paste UVs. For the strategy here, let's select End to End. And if you look at the tooltip here, it says a number of faces must be equal to source. So we are copying, since this mesh is perfectly symmetrical, we'll copy all of the polygons from one side to the other side, which means we will have an equal selection in the end. So let's do an end-to-end strategy here. And where it says copy here, Let's copy. We can just use default here. This is just useful if we have more than one UV set or more than one UV map. You'll see the other UV maps in there, but since we only have one here, we might as well just use default. With our selection, then, that has been copied over, let's do Control-I. That will invert our selection. And of course, we will wind up having the exact same number of polygons that are selected the other side. And then let's go to Paste here and do a default paste. And this will probably look broken like this. And you may actually be thinking right now that it did not actually work properly, but everything is fine so far. Let's go in the bottom left here within Paste UVs. And in there, let's do a Flip Copied UVs. And after that, we want to play around with this Rotate Copied UV little slider that is right here. And take a look at this. If I put this to number 1, you can see how now all our UVs have been copied over properly. You can see that our seams are kind of looking a little bit awkward there. So let's just turn off here where it says seams so that we do not change or add new seams in here. And take a look at that. It's as simple as that. We now have mirrored UVs. Let's go back to our UV window. So of course now all our UVs are overlapping, which we obviously do not want to keep in the end. So we want to select the side of the face that has been mirrored, and we want to flip them yet again, and then move them on the other side of the UV window so that we can merge the two halves of the face together. Let's go to Select. Let's select Flipped, which will select for us all of the polygons that have been flipped. We can hold G now to move these over. Within UV then, let's go to Mirror and do a mirror on the X-axis. Here you go. Let's go to Edge Mode here. And before we do our merging, let's just make sure that the middle seam is completely nice and straight. Because right now my seam is not actually perfectly straight. So actually, let me just grab all these vertices here. Make sure I only have the vertices here that are creating the midline of the face. Let's do an alignment of those, just like that. In fact, we should probably do the same thing for the vertices on the mirrored side. And then while being in edge mode, let me hold Alt to select the edge loop that's in the middle of the face. Do the same thing on the bottom. Press Alt V, press Enter. And you might have to play with some of these options. If Snap Islands is turned off for some reason, you can see the kind of result we're going to get. That's not very pretty. So just make sure that that is turned on. This particular value here will allow you to select which will be the island that will be merged to. We could actually complete this by just either relaxing or doing a quick unwrap on the seam that's in the middle to make sure that there are no stretching here. So perhaps I can just grab these particular vertices here. Let's make sure that we are grabbing them in a symmetrical fashion, of course. I could try a bigger box selection if I want, as long as I'm making sure that it is mirrored. I mean, it's not strictly necessary for these UVs to be completely mirrored, of course. But why not at this particular stage, right? Another thing that I could do is to get this particular UV island to be at the perfect center here of our UV window. So let me just, in fact, let's switch over here to UV select mode to select island. Let's select the island afterward. Let's turn on snap. Let's snap to increment. Now let's do an absolute grid snap. And you can see that when I'm going to move it then, it's going to snap the center of our selection directly to the center of the UV window. You can see how this particular edge loop now is directly centered in the middle of our 0 to 1 space, at least on the x-axis. And it also means that here I might actually have to move these vertices inwards a little bit. They're not quite fitting within the 0 to 1 space, so we need to squish them in just a little bit. Let me take the vertices down. Let's turn off snap. Let's grab the vertices from both sides. And let's try doing a scale on this. So press S and then press X to constrain to the x-axis. And that looks pretty good to me. Yeah, it looks pretty good to me. So yeah, take a look at these UVs. Pretty nice, right? But one thing I could do though is to do a little bit more of that unwrap on the vertices near the center line, because I can see a little bit of wobbliness in this particular zone. So let's just try to see if we can address that. So that's all we have to do for the face itself. Now we want to simply pack in the rest of the UV islands that we are missing. We can start with the ear. It's going to be the harder one to fit in there, although looking at the amount of dead space that we have, I don't think it's going to be that hard, to be honest. I mean, we could even maybe fit the ear in here, although no, we can't fit both ears in here. I would like to place these ears in a symmetrical fashion if I can. They actually fit quite nicely here. Of course, one thing that's important is to also keep a little bit of padding around these particular UV islands. You could be tempted to kind of pack this in extremely tightly like this, but if you do that, you're actually going to start to have issues around the borders of your UVs because of something called MIB mapping. I believe I've made a YouTube video on that particular topic, so you can go and check that out. Can be a complex topic to talk about, but simply keep in mind that it's important that you keep a little bit of a space between your UV shells. How much space should you keep? Well, I've kind of always just more or less eyeballed it, really. You just want to keep an appreciable gap at, let's say, this particular distance here, perhaps. You still want to see a slight gap between your UV shells. It's not very scientific, but if you can actually spot a nice gap between your UV shells at this particular distance, you'll be fine. All right, so let's scale this down a little bit so that we keep a little bit of that padding around the circumference of the ear. So perhaps something about this here. If I look at it from this distance again, I have a little bit of a gap here, and that's going to be totally fine. Now that we're done placing this particular UV island that is here, we want to copy its UVs over to the other ear in a symmetrical fashion so that the other ear winds up perfectly symmetrical on the other side of the texture. But before we actually do that, let's actually pack in the other UV islands that we want to have symmetrical in this particular case. So the back of the ear and the eye bag. For the mouth bag, since we will have to do essentially the exact same approach as we have done for the main UV island of the head, we'll have to symmetrize it, and then we will have to merge the seam that's in the middle, and then we'll snap it to the middle here. So we'll fit it right here within our texture space. But okay, so we want to move in the eye bags in the back of the ear. So this particular UV island, that's the proper one. So I want to move this one so that it is about here. Let's keep a nice gap there too between this particular UV island and all the other ones that we have. I think I have to scale down the back of the ear here a little bit. You can see that the color here, if I'm getting a color that's cyan, that means that the size here is pretty good in relation to the rest of the UV islands that we have. We're getting a pretty uniform texel density. And then we can fit here the mouth bag in the space that is left right here. There's a few more steps for the mouth bag, so I guess we'll do it afterward. We can now copy these 3 UV islands over to the other side in a symmetrical fashion. We're going to use the same tool that we have used so far, so the copy paste UVs. And if this kind of screws up, then I have a workaround for you. So in my 3D window then, let me turn on the viewport overlays here once again so I can see which are the UV islands that we want to copy over. Let's press L here while our cursor is over the ear. We want to copy that over. And in this particular case, I guess I can select linked by seam because I actually want to select the back of the ear as well. And I want to select the eye bag as well. So just like we've done before, let's go to copy here within copy paste UVs. Let's do a copy on this. And now I obviously cannot press Control I to inverse my selection. So we'll just have to do the same selection, but on the other side of the face. Let's select the ear first, and then let's press L to select the eye bag. And then let's do a paste on top of this. Let's turn on flipped UVs, and let's play around with this rotate copied UV value that is right here. See if we can get these to work quite well. Yeah, that's looking pretty good here. That's pretty cool. Let's turn off seams here. Back of our ears looking pretty good too. And the inside of the eye is also looking really good. So I mentioned that there was a bug. We're not getting it in this particular case, but I'll still show you the workaround because perhaps you will actually get a problem. The kind of bug is that sometimes some of these, even if you play with these particular values here, the rotate copied UV slider that is right here, even if you turn on flip copied UVs, it's possible in certain cases that not all of these polygons actually seem to have copied and flipped over properly. You may actually get some of these that still look like they're kind of rotated. You know, if I put this particular value here back at 0, you can see how some of these faces, you can see that the UVs are simply rotated. And so there might be situations where even though you have the same number of polygons that is selected on both sides of the face, you may not actually be able, even by playing around with these values right here, to completely get the UVs to look like they are in the proper orientation. So if that's the case, I have a workaround for you, but we'll do that at the second stage. Let's just finish this here first. Okay, so back within our UV editor, because we have sync selection that is off, means that the only UV islands that we see are the ones that are currently selected within our 3D viewport. So this should be actually fairly simple. Let's do a box selection to select all our UV islands. And really now it's just as simple as doing a mirror H here within our text tools. But you can see that if I do that right now, the center of the mirror is actually the center of the selection as opposed to the center of the 0 to 1 space there. So we can fix that here very, very simply by simply going within the pivot drop-down menu that is right here and selecting here the 2D cursor. Of course, you gotta also make sure that your 2D cursor is centered first. So if that's not the case for some reason, of course, hold Shift and do a right click to move the cursor over, and therefore turn on snap here. Actually get rid of your selection just in case. Turn on snap here. Once again, snap to increment, absolute grid snap, and just hold Shift and do a right click until your 2D cursor snaps perfectly within the center of your 0 to 1 space. Let's reselect our islands. Let's redo our mirror. And there you go. If I reselect everything now within our 3D viewport, you can see that now these UV islands have been copied over properly. Okay, so what's this workaround that I've been talking about if for some reason copy-paste UVs doesn't work for you? What else can you do here? I'm going to take the UVs of this particular ear here. I'm just going to move them in a different location so that the colors actually look different between her two ears right there. Okay, so let's say that once again, I want to take the UVs over this particular ear and I want to copy them over to this particular ear, but not using copy-paste UVs. So is there another way we could actually do that? Well, the answer is yes. And so we'll be using transfer UVs instead. Now, if we just inspect here transfer UVs very quickly here, if I turn on the little checkbox that is there, if I select actually the first ear, so the ear that I want to copy over, so this one here, within the transfer UV, you can see that I can actually press copy right here. But if I do that, if I try to do a copy here while I have this particular ear that is selected, you can see that I'm actually getting a warning here at the bottom that it says that 2 faces must be selected, which is very awkward because you could be wondering, well, if I ever want to copy more than 2 faces over, what's going to happen then? What transfer UV does is that it walks through the topology that you have and it reconstructs the UVs based upon that. I suppose that my explanation can't really go deeper than that. Okay, so the way the transfer UV works is that you simply select 2 polygons that you have over your mesh. And just for the sake of safety, I like to select polygons that are near the midline of the character. I don't know if that actually makes a difference or not, but I like to select 2 polygons starting from the midline of the character there. So we'll select the 2 polygons here that are at the base of the neck. And I'm going to select first the polygon that is closest to the center line. And then I will afterward hold Shift and select the polygon that is right next to it. And with those 2 polygons that are selected, we can now click Transfer UV. And now what we want to do is to select the 2 polygons that are opposite of that. And now we can paste. So if I just click paste here, you'll see that once again, our UVs are going to become completely broken. If while I do this paste, if I invert the normals here within our transfer UV dialog box right here, take a look at that. We have transferred our UVs in a symmetrical fashion from one side of the face to the other side of the face. So I guess if all you want to do is mirror the whole UVs of an object, this is a very complicated way of doing so. But you can now see that our ear has inherited the UVs that we want to give it. So now we can use our copy-paste UVs over this. This is the only UV island for which we want to keep these particular UVs. So it's going to be the only one that we are going to select here. And now let's do copy on top of this here. With these UVs that are now stored within the clipboard, we can actually undo the transfer UVs to go back to our original state. But the UVs that we have copied are still in the clipboard. So if I reselect this ear here and now do a paste on top of this, take a look at this. Well, obviously this is looking broken yet again because we are flipping the UVs, which we do not want to do in this particular case. So let's get rid of that here. Now let's put this value here back at 0. And there you go. So we did in the end use copy-paste UVs, but it was not to do the mirroring, if you will. So I know this seems a little bit complicated, but this is something that you can do if ever the copy-paste UV doesn't work for you for some reason. You can use transfer UV in this way to copy your UVs over symmetrically. So for the mouth bag, we'll do the same thing that we have done for the face. I'll just skip over this with you because this is essentially the same steps as we have done for the main UV island of the face. And there you go. This is what our final UVs look like for this head. Perhaps there's a few areas of improvement that are very minor. Perhaps these kind of UVs here, we could have perhaps found a way to make them nice and continuous on the other side of the face, as opposed to kind of cave in like this and create a bit of a V shape. But keep in mind, those are the vertices that are here that are starting to create the curve here at the top of the head within our UV island right here. So yeah, they kind of more or less always will have a shape that might look a little bit like this. It is also some of these UVs that are here, some of these lines that are here could perhaps continue across in a way that's a little bit more straight. Perhaps this is one of those places where we could actually try this shared vertex here, because it means that if I select this particular vertex here, it's going to move the vertex that's on the other side. So maybe I could actually try to see what happens if I take some of these vertices and slide them down a little bit. Are we going to get something here that's going to be a little bit more, I suppose, round for these UVs? Perhaps. Yeah, see. That kind of works. Yeah, it's a little bit better. It's probably as good as we're going to get it. Let me do a box selection on these vertices here. Do the same on the other side. Let's do a quick unwrap on this. Okay, there you go. There you go. That wasn't all that necessary, but why not, right? This seems looking nice and clean too. These UVs are really solid. I'm very, very happy with these. So there you go. That's the whole workflow of how to unwrap a head within Blender. But we're not actually done with this class yet, because I want to finish this class with projection and baking the vertex color that we have done on our head, so that the next class we can start to work on the tertiary details for this particular face. First of all, let's bring back the visibility of our high res there. So we have our high res and our low res within the scene here. Let me get out of edit mode for now. Let's go to our modifier properties here, and I still have a displace on top of this. Let me just go ahead and bake this in. So what we're essentially going to do is that we will subdivide this particular head, and then we will project the details. We will do what is essentially a shrink wrap. We will essentially just shrink wrap the subdivided version of this particular head over to the high poly that we have. So first we want to subdivide the head. We'll use a multi-res for that. Then we'll do a shrink wrap, which we will apply. One thing I want to do first, though, is just to check the vertex groups, because we're not going to project everything. We had created vertex groups that were useful so that not the whole head shrink wraps, but only part of the head shrink wraps. You know, we don't want to shrink wrap the eye creases. We don't want to shrink wrap the eye bags. We don't want to shrink wrap the mouth bag, of course, because those things don't exist on the high res. So I just want to check that vertex group, because we'll use essentially the same vertex group to continue to exclude the shrink wrap. So let me go back here within edit mode. Let me go within vertex here, and let's go within object data properties right here, where we have our vertex groups. And right here, so let me just select that right there. Yeah, see, that's perhaps a little bit bigger than what I actually kind of want it to be in the end. I think I want to exclude some of these vertices. So in this case, let me just click remove here. It's going to remove all these vertices from the vertex group. So now the vertex group is completely empty, as you can see. I'll just do Control Z here to bring back this particular selection. So after having removed all these vertices from the vertex group, now I'm just going to go in here with the lasso. So I'm going to hold Control Shift and do right click. And I'm just going to lasso away some of these extra vertices that I think should not be part of the vertex group anymore. And those are these here that are on the side of the face. Also, I'll just turn on wireframe to make sure that I'm not hitting the other side of the face or hitting any vertices that I wouldn't want to be hitting in this particular case. So let's get rid of all of these here. If I can avoid to shrink wrap the ear, I'll be quite happy, because I know that some of these very delicate structures will have a tendency to shift around a little bit too much, since the ear is asymmetric. So all the vertices that will remain in our selection will be vertices that will not be projected. So let me just deselect a whole lot of these vertices here so that we can project what will be most of these, but not necessarily all of these. Hopefully these won't give us too many problems. The eyes could be a little bit tricky. I guess I want to project everything up to the eye creases. And projecting part of the lower lid may not be a bad idea either, because those were in the right location mostly. So actually, Let me remove the lower eyelids from our selection. I'll try not to hit the eye bag while I'm doing this particular selection right now. And for the mouth, yeah, the mouth is fine. I'll keep the current selection that we have. Okay, so this will be our vertex group. So let's assign now. And if I deselect and I reselect the vertex group, yeah, so that's great. So let me take my head then. Let's go back to our modifiers. So now on top of this, let's add a multi-res. In fact, let me just take a look here. I want to see what's going to happen to the UVs, especially around the corner of the mouth here. As we subdivide, yeah, see, these are now becoming very nice. So I really love what's going on here. And the UVs around the eyes, yeah, take a look at this. Super nice, right? Super clean lines, very, very nice. These are holding up beautifully. Let me subdivide a second time. And what we're going to do, we're going to throw a shrink wrap on top of this. Let's go to add modifier, let's add a shrink wrap. And we more or less want the same options as we had when we were shrink wrapping in the context of retopology here. So let's select our target here, our high res. There you go. Vertex group here, let's specify the group that we have added. And let's click on this little arrow here to make sure that these are not being shrink wrapped. Wrap method here, let's go for target normal project. Snap mode, we want to snap outside the surface. And we could add another subdivision level. Let me hide the face here. Let me hide the high res because I want to see what the low res looks like. So let me select the high res here, press H to hide it. And for the low res, in fact, I think we can get rid of this texture now. We don't need that anymore. In fact, where it says vector now, let's just get rid of that here completely. Let's just remove that. Okay, here we go. Image texture here within base color, we can also remove that. Let's play around with the color here a little bit. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, yeah, take a look at this. Looking pretty good, right? So that is at only 720,000 triangles, is that right? I believe that's right. Let's subdivide this once more. Every time we subdivide this, we will reacquire more of those details that we had sculpted. And I think we could go at least one more level. Not quite sure what's going on here, though. That's kind of interesting. We'll have to take a look at that. We can kind of see the border here of the vertex group. That's okay. We can just smooth that once we have done with our projection here. We'll just do a quick smooth on top of this, and that will look good. Same thing with this here. I'm not quite sure what's going on. Probably something to do with the shrink wrap. I'm really tempted to try and find what is the reason for this. So let me just investigate this a little bit. So we're looking at the high res right now. And if we take a look on the inside of that. Oh yeah, okay, I found it. See, it's probably because of this here. It's probably because of this thing here. Whatever that is. Let's just go in sculpt mode and do a little bit of smoothing on this. This will probably be enough to get rid of that. And there you go, we fixed the problem. So the problem was coming from our high res. This color is pretty intense. Yeah, so this is looking really clean, right? Now, the higher we can go with the multi-res, the more detail we will be able to reacquire, of course, from the high poly. So essentially, we are limited by the polygons that we have on our new high res or on our low res that is subdivided. So the higher we can go for the multi-res, the more we will be able to get some of those very sharp details. We can still go at least one more, I believe so here. So let's go here and subdivide this yet again. This has given us here a few sharper details if we look at the eyebrows. Now, of course, our goal is to sculpt tertiary details ourselves on top of this. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter to keep these. But so this is pretty good. I'm not going to tempt fate by subdividing this one step further. It's very simple to collapse the shrink wrap. We simply have to go within our modifier and click on the little drop-down arrow that is right here and do an apply. And that's going to collapse the shrink wrap so that the data of the shrink wrap is now part of the multi-res. If I play here with the level that is in the viewport, you'll see what I'm talking about here. I can go back all the way down to our lowest subdivision level, as you can see. And even if I go back here to our highest subdivision level, we still have all that data that we had baked out with the shrink wrap that is now part of the multi-res. Take a look at how great of a work that it has done with these eye creases right there. There's a very slight sharp border here, but we can just smooth that away very, very simply there. But other than that, this data is extremely clean. If we go within sculpt mode, you can see that we still have our face sets that are there. And as we go up here, so let me right 5 here to go to our highest subdivision level here. You can see that this particular face set here, the border to the face set here is still nicely following the nasolabial fold, and we have those face sets around the eyes that are nicely following the shape of the eyes. So this is still working really, really nice for us. And of course, it means that we can now take our sculpting brushes and we can go to town and start to sculpt some very high frequency detail on this if we wanted to. Which of course we want to. That's the next thing that we will do here. So we can erase the old high poly from this particular scene. We don't need it anymore after we have done one last step, which is to reacquire the albedo, because we have painted an albedo on this head and we want to keep that here. So we don't want to lose the work that we have done on the albedo, of course. The only thing in this particular case though is that the albedo here has been painted using vertex color. And unfortunately, we cannot do that using multi-res. Multi-res does not support vertex color beyond vertex color for the lowest subdivision level, which isn't all that useful because the lowest subdivision level is quite low res. So it would just give us some very diffuse splotches of color to work with when we want to keep all of this nice detail there. So we're essentially going to bake out our first texture. We'll bake out the vertex color pass that we have done on our old high res. We'll bake that out to a texture on the new head, so the low res that has been subdivided. We'll bake that out as a texture. We'll be able to use that for display purposes, and we will continue the albedo from that particular base at a later point within the future. So we can finish our class with this. I'll press Ctrl Z here to snap the old high res back to its original location. Make sure you save your seed in this stage because we will have to collapse the multi-res yet again. So you can just reload your scene later on and reacquire the multi-res in there. We're going to keep this very simple. We're not going to do any kind of projection from high poly to low poly in this particular case. We will do something that's going to be a lot simpler there. So we're going to collapse the multi-res. I'm going to apply it. And then afterward, we will add another modifier to this, which will be a data transfer. Within the data transfer then, let's select our source, which is our high poly, or head high in this particular case. And then where it says vertex data here, let's click on this and say that we want to transfer the colors. What we are essentially doing is that we are projecting the vertex colors of the old high poly onto the new high poly. But we're not actually seeing it here because the vertex color is not what is currently applied within the material. So let me isolate this here, and then let's go afterward within our material properties. And where it says base color then, let's actually switch this over to a color attribute. If this looks completely black like this, it means that there's actually no vertex color channel on the mesh so far. So let's actually add one of those. Let's go within our object data properties where it says color attributes in here. Just click on the little plus that is right there. You can keep the default options. This will simply add a vertex color channel to your mesh. And here we go. We can go back to our modifiers. We can now apply the data transfer. And our new high poly now has the vertex color of the old high poly. Now, as we said, the only problem with this is that this does not work with the multi-res. So if I was to reconstruct the multi-res in this particular case to go back to the lowest subdivision level, we would actually lose the vertex color. Actually, we would preserve the vertex color, but we would wind up with vertex color that is very blurry because it would be applied on the vertices at the lowest subdivision level. So it's a bit of a limitation of Blender that we cannot actually see the vertex color using multi-res, but perhaps in a future version that will be addressed. But for now, at least, what we simply want to do now is we want to bake this out as a base color texture, and then we will apply that through the shader afterward. So we'll do that using text tools. So let's go back within our UV editor. Still have it here open on the side. Let's select our head here. Let's go within edit mode. This might get a little bit heavy though. Yeah, that's kind of slow. I mean, if this creates problem, then of course, more traditional baking using high poly, low poly could actually work, but we will do that in a future class. Let's go to baking now. And where it says tangent normal, let's select base color. We'll be baking out using the same size that we have specified here. So we'll bake out an AK texture. Let's press bake. And we're done. We're just not seeing the texture here because the wireframe here is taking over. But if I turn off here the overlays, there you go. We have our texture now. We can now save this out. Let's go to image. Let's go to save as. Save this out somewhere. We can close this. I'm going to reload the scene now because I had applied the multi-res. It's going to be simpler just to reload the scene than to have to unsubdivide the mesh. Okay, so I've reloaded the scene here and we have baked out our vertex color. So it means that I can now finally delete this here. This was our old high res and this is our new head. Then I can move this over within my collection that is right here. And if we want to complete this work then, let's go back within our material properties where it says base color. Let's select a image texture. Let's open the texture that we have baked out. And there you go. We finally have our base color that is applied on our new low res, which is also now the high res, of course, on which we will continue to do our sculpting. So that's all of the steps involved in taking your head that had been sculpted using remesh, doing a retopology for it, doing UVs, projection, baking out the vertex color, and now we are finally in a position where we can start our tertiary details, or we could even take this head and we could even do a skinning pass on top of it if we wanted to. So I hope this was interesting. Ultimately, I'm not sure how many hours of content this will have been in the end if you consider the retopology classes, unwrapping, projection. It's a pretty involved process to retopologize something. Of course, if this is the first time that you go through this particular process, it probably will take you a while to go through all of these technical steps. But although it seems like there are a lot of steps that we had to go through, when you're experienced, you can actually go through these steps fairly quickly. I mean, retopology will take some time. Then for the unwrapping, you don't always necessarily have to go to the degree of detail that we have when we're unwrapping this particular head. Projection is also relatively quickly there, so really it's usually the retopology that takes the most time. And depending on the complexity of an object that you are dealing with, you could probably get done with all of these steps in perhaps about a day or two. Of course, if you want to retopologize a full character, you can probably schedule at least a week of your time to be able to do that properly. I'm very much looking forward to explore with you the next steps in the process of creating this head, which will be to create our tertiary details, which is skin pores, fine wrinkles, perhaps continue to do a little bit of polish on the anatomy of this head, because this is a likeness, so that particular process feels never-ending. We'll also take a look at the eyes, not necessarily the eyeballs themselves, I'm quite happy with these, but how can we get a transition mesh in there from the eyelids to the eyeballs? How can we get some eyelashes in there? We'll do the full process with this particular head, or at least that is the goal as of today there. So there's a lot of very interesting content coming, and I'm quite glad that we have gotten these steps out of the way, retopology, unwrap, because we've gotten a lot of those technical steps out of the way, and we can now have some fun to simply improve this head from an artistic standpoint and really start to add features upon features that's going to make this head look much nicer in a render. So I can't wait to get started with what comes next. Thanks for watching this particular class. Good luck with your unwrap and your projection, and I will see you next time. Take care.